Okay, ma'am, you can start now.
Greetings to everyone across the globe who is joining us on this very special occasion. On behalf of the American Institute of Indian Studies, I am delighted to welcome you to this inaugural event marking the 40th anniversary of the Archives and Research Center for Ethnomusicology, one of our 2 research centers located in India. My name is Sumati Ramaswamy, and it is my honor to serve as the president of the Institute. Both our research centers hold a very special place in my heart, especially since I'm a historian myself, and so much of the work done by these centers is of enormous historical value in addition to being of value to those doing scholarship in a wide array of disciplines and knowledge fields. In the case of the Archives and Research Center for Ethnomusicology, or ARCE, these include music history and culture, the performing arts, and oral traditions across India. My own association with the center predates my current role as president and goes back to 2003, when as a program officer for the Ford Foundation, it was a real privilege to make a grant in support of a most innovative project that the center undertook called Remembered Rhythms on the music of the South Asian diaspora. More recently, the center has been critical to the many digital initiatives we are pursuing at the Institute, as we also mark the 60th anniversary of the founding of the AIIS. Now, you'll hear more of the center's history and accomplishments over the course of this virtual conference, and especially at its opening session. But it remains for me to express my deepest gratitude to a number of folks involved in planning this event, beginning with Professor Tony Seeger of the University of California in Los Angeles, who serves as the most visionary chair of the Faculty Advisory Committee for the center, and the center's fabulous director, Dr. Shubha Chaudhuri. I also join our Director General in New Delhi, Purnima Mehta, from whom you will hear shortly, in thanking Catlin-Jairazbhoy, Daniel Newman, Bonnie Wade, Stephen Slavic, and Amy Catlin, among others, for all that they have done over the decades in helping the center reach the place that it has in our educational and research landscape. An immense thanks also to the staff of ARCE in Gurugram and our New Delhi office led by Purnima Mehta, and to Elise Auerbach and Anandi Silva Napel in our Chicago office for all the logistical behind-the-scenes planning for an event of this scale. Not least, my immense appreciation to the many folks who have registered for this event and have logged in. Your show of support is a measure of the value that the center holds in your work and in your heart. And with this, I hand over the baton to our Director General in New Delhi, Purnima Mehta.
Thank you, Sumati. It continues to be a great honor to have you at the helm as the president of AIIS. Our very first female president. Marking the 60th year of AIIS through a series of year-long events was really your idea, amongst the many other valuable events and programs that you have launched during your ongoing tenure. Thank you once again. Good evening, good morning, and a very warm welcome to this 3-day virtual conference on navigating the digital age in the archival universe. My name is Purnima Mehta. I'm the Director General of the American Institute of Indian Studies, and it is a special honor for me to chair session 1 on early years of ARCE and the AIIS. The AIIS was formed in 1961 to further the knowledge of India in the United States by supporting American scholarship on India. The programs of AIIS promote and advance mutual understanding between the citizens of the United States of America and of India. AIIS is a consortium of more than 90 American universities and colleges. It is dedicated to the intellectual engagement with India and to the dissemination of the most informed knowledge of India's past, present, and future. To this end, it provides research fellowships that have trained 3 generations of scholars, offers world-class instruction in Indian languages, facilitates study abroad and educational programs, and maintains two extraordinary archives devoted to India's cultural heritage, the Center for Art and Archaeology and the Archives and Research Center for Ethnomusicology. The AIIS is marking the 60th anniversary this year in 2022. The ARCE is contributing to the 60th anniversary of the AIIS with this virtual conference involving Indian and international participants as it celebrates its own 40th anniversary. We are delighted to be collaborating with the India International Center, our longtime collaborator, which is also celebrating its 60th anniversary this year. The conference dates, as you may have noticed, include October 27, which is UNESCO World Audiovisual Heritage Day. This conference was planned using its previous major conference on the eve of the millennium. Preservation of the Millennium was the title, as a point of reference to review changes in audiovisual archiving and ethnomusicology in the past 2 decades. We start with the focus on ARCE for the first day in light of its growth against the backdrop of the changes that have taken place. We then go on to a wider canvas. The topics have been chosen with the counsel of the organizing committee, who consisted of Kevin Bradley, Ilse Assmann, Matthew Allen, Amlan Dasgupta, Anthony Seeger, and Shubha Chaudhuri. The International Committee also was very helpful in identifying speakers and panelists. As always, we are very pleased that we have a good level of Indian participants in the program. We do apologize for the timings, which were designed to make sure that participants in India and the US could participate, as well as Europe and Africa. We apologize to our Australian colleagues for the very inconvenient hours and would like to express our special thanks to Kevin Bradley and Linda Barwick, who have agreed to present their papers and be present for the discussion in spite of this. In this session, we are looking forward to learning more about ARCE as it completes 40 years and has done stellar work under the very able and committed leadership of its Associate Director General, Dr. Shubha Chaudhuri, together with a very dedicated staff, our current and invaluable committee chair, Dr. Anthony Seeger, our former committee chairs, Nazir-Jarazbhoy, Daniel Newman, Bonnie Wade, Stephen Slowick, all of whom have been instrumental in taking ARCE to heights and promoting international cooperation in the field of audiovisual archiving and ethnomusicology. My sincere gratitude to Professor Seeger and Dr. Chaudhuri for envisioning this international conference, and very special thanks to the organizing committee and to all our participants. Without waiting any further, I would now like to invite our main speaker for this session, Professor Daniel Newman. You have the detailed bios on the website, but very briefly, Professor Daniel Newman is the author of The Life of Music in North India and Studying India's Musicians, 4 decades of selected articles, as well as co-author of Bards, Ballads, and Boundaries, an ethnographic atlas of music traditions in Western Rajasthan. He is now Professor Emeritus at the University of California at Los Angeles. Dan, over to you.
Okay, thank you. I'm audible, I assume, right?
Yes.
And what I will do is I did prepare a little PowerPoint. So as I talk, we'll have a few slides to show you. And let's see if this actually works. So do you see this opening slide? Are we on? Or do I have to share a screen?
You have to share, I think. Okay.
Is the share screen on?
Not yet.
I have my share screen on.
Sir, you
Can you
have
see
to
it?
use the share screen option just like last time.
I do. I have it on. So that's not working, huh? We had it working a little bit before. Let me try one other thing. What about now?
No.
No?
No, not yet. Yeah.
Can you turn on my shared screen from your end?
No, we can't. We can only close the share screen once you your permissions are granted. So once you only have to start it, we can close it from your end.
Yeah, but somehow I have it on. That's what's so strange.
Can you
I have my
check
shared
now?
screen on.
Can you check now again?
Okay, I have it on. You don't see it?
No,
No.
not yet.
Okay, well, I will, I'll do it here without the shared screen. But, so you don't see anything, huh? I'll just read the paper. And this is a slide of Nazir that you're missing, but I begin. Nazir-Jairazbhoy, the distinguished India-raised ethnomusicologist, had an extraordinary vision that he put down on paper in 1978 to establish a sound archive in India. Just before setting in motion what would become the Archive and Research Center for Ethnomusicology, ARCE, Nazir himself had undergone some major professional changes. In 1975, he was recruited to UCLA from the University of Windsor in Canada, where he had gone from SOAS a little bit earlier. He was also elected president of the Society for Ethnomusicology in 1975, where he served until 1977. My first contact with what became the ARCE was in 1979. I had been invited to review a grant proposal as a member of the Smithsonian Committee on Anthropology and Archaeology, a review panel chaired by Francine Berkowitz, who headed that program at the Smithsonian Institution. The Smithsonian Institution had access to some PL 480 funds that were available as Indian rupees to support research projects in India. Nazir-Jairazbhoy's proposal to the Smithsonian was titled Proposal for the Formation of the Archives and Research Center for Ethnomusicology of the American Institute of Indian Studies. His intention to establish an ethnomusicology sound archive in India had three objectives, and here I quote from the original proposal. 1, to stimulate ethnomusicology in India. 2, to centralize and make accessible both to Indian and foreign scholars research materials pertaining to Indian music, which would not otherwise be available in India. And 3, to advise and assist foreign scholars in the conducting of music research in India. But in talking about this proposal with Nazir years ago, it was clear that his original motivation was archival repatriation. He felt strongly that foreign scholars were taking music recordings out of India without leaving anything behind. He was also concerned that older historical collections, such as the Bakke recordings, as well as his own, also be repatriated to India through the ARCE. Few others then were thinking about how their research might benefit India more broadly and be available for the communities being studied more specifically. When Nazir's proposal reached the Smithsonian Institution, it was enthusiastically received, and if I recall correctly, unanimously approved. Nazir anticipated early on that rapid changes in India would necessitate the documentation of practices that were at risk of transforming or rapidly disappearing. Although now out of intellectual fashion, then there was at the time a great concern for documenting rapidly disappearing music traditions around the world. 1978, recall, is almost 2 decades before the World Wide Web got started in the mid-90s. The American Institute of Indian Studies was founded in 1961 as a non-governmental consortium of American universities to promote research in India. The ARCE, I'm now showing the third slide with Nazir breaking a coconut in Pune. The ARCE was formally inaugurated on September 1st, 1982. This followed a special meeting held earlier in Delhi on September 7th, 1981. Nazir was chair of the Committee on Ethnomusicology of the AIS, with Bonnie Wade and I as the other two members. Pradeep Mahendratta was then director of AIS. It was at this meeting that all agreed to, number one, 2 locations for the ARCE, the main archive in Pune and the receiving station in Delhi, and 2, that Ashok Ranade and Umashankar be both formally appointed. Ranade was to commute monthly from Mumbai to Pune as a consultant and was to be formally appointed effective January 1, 1982. On September 1st, 1982, Dr. Shubha Chaudhuri was appointed the Liaison and Publications Officer. Of course, she would go on to become ARCE's leader for the next 4 decades. I'm now showing a slide with Pradeep and Francine and Ashok and a couple of others. The distinguished musicologist Ashok Ranade was the first associate director of research for the ARCE. The fact that he agreed to be employed by an American institution took some courage on his part, because the idea of Indian scholars working for a foreign entity was distinctly not regarded as a prestigious move. The fact that the word ethnomusicology was in the title didn't help matters. Ethnomusicology was considered a pejorative term in India at the time. The term was typically thought of, if they thought of it at all, as a study of primitive and/or folk music, and of course theirs, thinking of their cultivated traditions of Hindustani and Carnatic, was not either. The ARCE held an audio technology workshop, and I have a photograph of the slide from that workshop in 1983, followed by a big international conference documenting and archiving in ethnomusicology in 1984. This was mainly Nazir and Ashok Ranade's idea, and it was supported by the Ford Foundation. Then sometime in 1984, I was appointed chair of the committee as Nazir's 3-year term was over, although of course he remained on the committee. During this 1984-85 period, the Delhi ARCE receiving station was moved 3 times, although all within the defense colony locale. The final home of the ARCE in Delhi was at B-29 Defense Colony, and I have a photograph of it here, before the archive moved to Gurgaon in 1998. Furthermore, equipment that had been funded by a generous grant from the Ford Foundation, actually more than one, and had been ordered for the Delhi receiving station and Pune archive had been sent back to the US because of Indian customs regulations. It was finally received in November 1984, unfortunately, on the very day that Indira Gandhi was assassinated.
Dan,
So it still
9
could be
out of 10
delivered.
minutes. Sorry to interrupt. It's 9 minutes out of 10. So you have one.
Okay. Receiving equipment continued to be a problem, including one large consignment that was held in Delhi customs for over a year and then disappeared completely and was never recovered. The committee, I'll make this very short. The committee was expanded, and I have here a slide of the expanded committee with Tony Seeger and Sue Wadley. And then I talk about the seminar on text, tones, and tunes that was held at the end of December through the beginning, end of December 86 through the beginning of 87 at the Indian International Center. And I have a slide here, Bonnie Wade and Albert Lord. And in 87, we began installing the equipment we finally got. And there's a picture of Umashankar with lots of tape recorders and so forth. I talk about the beginnings of the collaboration with Kamal Kothari and the Rajasthan Atlas project that began in 89. And I end with another photograph of the committee. By the 1990s, Nazir's vision of an archive of recordings basically had been achieved. And the next stage of the story of ARCE would involve the move to Gurgaon and the adapting to a fiscal environment in which PL 480 funds would no longer be available. And with that, I thank you.
Thank you, Dan, and sorry to interrupt you. Thank you very much for these very valuable insights. We turn now to our next panelist, Bonnie C. Wade. Bonnie has been chair of the AIIS Ethnomusicology Committee and AIIS trustee for UC Berkeley. She serves on the Ethnomusicology series editorial board for the University of Chicago Press. Her several books include Music in India, The Classical Traditions, Khayal, Creativity Within Northern India's Classical Vocal Tradition, and Imaging Sound, an ethnomusicological study of music, art, and culture in Mughal India. Bonnie is Professor Emerita of Music, University of California at Berkeley. I now invite Bonnie Wade to join in.
Good morning, everyone, and good morning very early in the morning to a number of you. I'm pleased to be speaking. I want to thank Dan for his reiteration of the very beginning of the ARCE, the very first steps that were taken by Nazir, who is really our hero here. Also the path for connecting to the AIIS and its welcoming of a complex, ambitious new project along with the flourishing Center for Art and Archaeology. Also the Smithsonian Institution, who was managing the PL 480 funds. These are very early steps. The Ford Foundation India, who was for so long like a partner in the process as well. I want to acknowledge the sustained role of not only Dan, but also it was Pradeep Mahendrata and Ashok Ranade and Shubha and Umashankar, who were so important at every step of the way in the very early days. And also I would like to add thanks to Tony Seeger, who, when he first joined the committee in 1985, it really could not have been anticipated what a sustained and important role you would take, Tony, and I have appreciated that through time. The 2.5-day retreat of the Committee on Ethnomusicology at my home in Berkeley in that year of 1985, when Tony and Susan Wadley joined the committee, was really a kind of watershed moment. And I'm going to skip a whole bunch. I'm happy to see us being truly limited to our time. And so I'm going to skip what I was going to do, a bit of reiteration about the prongs of the work of the ARCE that will be covered again in a moment. For me, the two projects in the 1980s, two projects encapsulated the sort of ambitious work that was envisaged to be undertaken by the archives from the time it was founded. One was the international conference held in 1984 that focused on processes of ethnomusicological research. Its title, as Dan mentioned, was Documenting and Archiving in Ethnomusicology. I so regret that we didn't see your photographs, Daniel, because they are priceless for the spirit that they impart. Perhaps in the discussion we can get it working. The other project in the 1980s for me was that week-long international conference held in the New Year's season as 1986 gave way to 1987, focusing on research results presented through a set of scholarly papers by very distinguished scholars addressing musical practice and ideas in a panoply of cultures. That conference title, Text, Tone, and Tune, Parameters of Music in Multicultural Perspective, was an outstanding selection of people and papers. Both of those conferences were major efforts, considering that ARCE had been founded only in 1982. That both were expressly international seems to me to have been a spectacular means of announcing to the world as well as within India, the creation and work of the AIIS-ARCE. Both conferences addressed a main purpose of the archives, namely fostering ethnomusicological research in India, albeit from two totally different perspectives. Whereas no publication resulted from the first conference, it was a different kind of conference with a fieldwork project, and that kind of thing is difficult to capture in a volume. A volume containing almost all the papers presented in the second conference, Text, Tone, and Tune, was published by Oxford and IBH Publishing Company in India, and it is still available. Here is that beautifully produced, for which thank you, Shubha Chaudhuri. Just to give you a sense of the international distinction of this conference, I'm going to proceed to go a bit farther in discussion of that conference. One paragraph and an additional sentence in Dan's paper lead me to making certain observations about the conference, which we called TTT, Text, Tone, and Tune. Dan contextualizes the agreement on the part of the distinguished Indian musicologist Ashok Ranade to be employed by an American institution as the Associate Director of Research for the ARC. Dan explained, the idea of Indian scholars working for a foreign entity was distinctly not regarded as a prestigious matter. The fact that the word ethnomusicology in the title didn't help matters. That very name of the field, as he mentioned, was considered a pejorative term by musicologists in India at the time. We in ARCE wanted to be certain that our field was understood more realistically, more broadly in India, as was stated in the preface to the book that was later published from the TTT conference. The field was conceived as the study of all types of music in their individual social and cultural contexts. The individuals invited to present had done research not only in multiple cultures, but on multiple types of musical practices as well. I want to just reiterate who they were and the variety of subjects that were presented. Albert Lord, scholar of comparative literature, speaking on South Slavic sung narrative. Ashok Ranade, musicologist on classical and semi-classical musics of North and South India. Susan Wadley, anthropologist on Indian folk music. Bruno Nettle, musicologist and anthropologist on musics of multiple types in multiple cultures. Anthony Seeger, anthropologist on verbal art forms in a native Brazilian community. Regula Burkhart Qureshi, anthropologist on the Urdu ghazal. Karai Kudi Subramanian, music theorist on text and music relationships in compositions by Carnatic composers. Premlata Sharma, musicologist on perspectives on text and music in Sanskrit treatises. David Copeland, anthropologist on sung poetry of South African migrant workers. Rulan Chao Pian on Chinese dramatic and narrative music. Onkar Prasad on Santal ethnic minority music. Komal Kothari gave an oral presentation on Rajasthani music, and Kapila Bhattacharya on Indian classical dance. There was one more speaker, namely American musicologist Richard Taruskin. Dan had cut this out of his oral presentation, but he explicitly pointed out in his paper that I nominated him for participation in the conference, whereas no one else's nominations are singled out. And I wanted to explain this. The conference was planned in lively discussion among the members of the AIIS Committee on Ethnomusicology, as it was then called. Given the international nature of the intended participation, the themes had to be broad. TTT emerged as a particularly appropriate theme for the Indian setting, a culture which relishes all three and has an ancient tradition of theorizing about them. When the list of potential speakers and their spheres of research had been vetted, there was one notable type of music missing on which considerable work had been done, namely Western classical music. Surely, I thought, if we had good representation of research on Indian classical music, we should not ignore the sphere of European tradition from the new open-minded new field of ethnomusicology. But an appropriate musicologist would be needed for this gathering. As it happened in a recent search for a new appointment in musicology at my institution, University of California, Berkeley, I had learned about the interest of up-and-coming historian of Russian opera, Richard Taruskin, who, as an undergraduate student at Columbia, had so enjoyed delving into perspectives on Indian culture, including music, that he had since wanted to visit the country. Furthermore, from exposure to early ethnomusicology as a young professor at Columbia University, he was not only aware of the burgeoning new field, but respected the Catholicity of
10
spirit.
minutes, Bonnie.
10 minutes already?
Yes, sorry about that.
Oh, okay.
You can
That's
wrap
okay.
up. You can take half a minute to wrap up, I think.
Half a minute, okay. But I wanted to, yes, okay. I skipped completely. Let me see. I wanted to explain, excuse me. All right, I'll end with that Nazir's prevailing purpose for the ARCE, the repatriation of musical materials collected by foreign scholars. My first research in India, field research, was a focus on wedding songs sung by women in ceremonies held in the home villages of brides and grooms. From that experience, I produced only 2 articles, one that documented a very small sampling of songs to show the kinds of things that went on. The second article was about the nature of the project, one that was far more complex than I had envisaged, requiring a team of researchers with various spheres of expertise and also logistically. The title of the article was By Invitation Only, Fieldwork in Village India. Access to female residents of any village in which one did not reside was by permission of males, and I was fortunate to gain access to any by the gracious cooperation of anthropology graduate students at Delhi University and other individuals. Needless to say, I changed my research project. Why do I mention this? As it happened, one of the villages to which I was welcomed and where I made recordings was a village called Jharsa in the state of Haryana, a village that was literally behind the property in Gurgaon, to which the AIIS headquarters and ARCE moved in 1989. I only realized this when Shubha wrote to me in that year to tell me that among the recordings that I had deposited in the archives were songs from that village, literally the backyard. That connection means a whole lot to me. And also my connection to the ARCE through the years has been so precious. May it flourish for decades ahead.
Thank you, Bonnie. Thank you so very much. And my apologies for interrupting you.
It's all right. I should have timed myself. I'm always stern with other people about that.
We now have Amy Catlin-Jairazbhoy. Amy and Nazir Ali Jairazbhoy co-directed Baake Restudy 1984, a documentary about repatriating Arnold Bake's 1938 footage and audio recordings of sacred music in Tamil Nadu, Karnataka, and Kerala. Currently, Amy is assisting UCLA's digital library project to provide online access to the 1984 audiovisual materials and continues to conduct Baake restudy research most recently in collaboration with Mapilla Muslims of Kerala. Amy has been supporting ARCE and continues to be an active donor. Amy, I now invite you to come and speak.
Thank you very, very much. I'm trying to share my screen. I hope it's working.
Yes.
Thank you, Dan and Bonnie, for your insightful chronologies. And it looks like a restudy is coming up in behind Gurugram. From the points of view of leading actors in the formation of ARCEs. Now, speaking from the view early collaborator, beneficiary, and wife, I'd like to go back now to ARC's gestation years, and then forward to ARCE's first research project, the Baca Restudy. Let's get this thing playing here. Play, play, play. Okay. The Baca Restudy and its sequels, and one ARC outreach project that I was privileged to join. Before ARC's early years, there was a gestation period. In 1932, when he was just 5 years old, Nazir Ali Jairazbhoy's mother became the first Indian woman to direct a documentary film, complete with intertitles. Amma sits in voluminous robes on Mount Arafat with her mother Shireen Musa Rajabali and her husband Qasim Ali Jairazbhoy beside her, along with a cinematographer, office staff, and local guide during their Hajj pilgrimage. The film was edited in Mumbai, and Nazir safeguarded it until 1969, when the original was misplaced during the transfer from London to Windsor, Canada. The film was shown in England, Europe, and the US during his father's lecture tours. As later corrected by Amma, who was a Muslim woman, not a Parsi, the headline and caption of this 1934 photo published in the Madras Mail say, "A Mohammedan lady's enterprise, Mrs. Jairazbhoy, a lady at present in London, has with great difficulty taken a film of the pilgrimage to Mecca. Despite the ban on taking films or photographs of sacred scenes, Mrs. Jairazbhoy has succeeded in presenting this film so attractively that the Nizam of Hyderabad has asked for and accepted a copy of it. The film is being exhibited in the course of friendship between Great Britain and the Muslim world. We're still trying to locate that historic silent film or its copy so that it might be archived one day, perhaps at ARCE." 2 decades later at SOAS in the 1950s and 60s, Nazir's relationship with his professor Arnold Adrian Baca grew from Guru Shishya into faculty colleagues and research collaborators. After Baca's sudden demise in 1963, during Nazir's field research in India in regions Baca had not yet surveyed, in preparation for a book they were writing on music of India, Nazir's role became rescuer and duplicator of Baca's copious collections. Baca had told Nazir that he was unable to find a place in India to give copies of his extensive audiovisual documentation, inspired by his mentor, Rabindranath Tagore, collected during 15 years of travel through the subcontinent and Sri Lanka. When Nazir returned to London in 1964 with his recordings and photos and films, he quickly rescued Baca's 768 Tefifone audio recordings made in 1938-39, had reel-to-reel transfers made of the Tefi recordings, and supervised their graduate student, Alistair Dick, to decipher Baca's handwritten Tefi labels and create a typed catalog of the audio recordings. Nazir soon brought real copies from London to the UCLA Ethnomusicology to serve as a shadow archive for the preservation, research, and dissemination of Baca's 1938 recordings. Based on Baca's 1938 recordings, we collaborated in 1984 with ARCE's brilliant staff, Dr. Ashok Ranade, Dr. Shubha Chaudhuri, sound technician Umashankar Mantravadi, archivist Dr. Saraswati Swaminathan, and librarian Kalpana Bandudekar, to create the field materials for the published video monograph Baca Restudy 1984, the preservation and transformation of tradition in Tamil Nadu, Kerala, and Karnataka, which we repatriated and screened in 1991 throughout those states and at ARCE in New Delhi, the late Dr. Kapila Vatsyayan, who praised it highly. After that, we made 24 more Baka restudy research trips from 1991 to 2020 to reconnect with the performers and their communities in Kerala, Tamil Nadu, Karnataka, Gujarat, Maharashtra, Sri Lanka, and Bengal, where I found correspondence with Tagore about Baka's and Tagore's collaborative project of surveying India's religious music. The first published video spin-off of the Baka study 1984 was an interactive DVD called Music for a Goddess, based on just 2 songs Baka recorded of Jogtis in Karnataka, resulting in a total of 175 minutes of scenes progressing from background to music, to rituals, to lives, to change, including many bonus tracks. Dr. Shubha Chaudhuri, ARCE's Director of Research, kindly arranged a screening of the 72-minute narrated film at Indian International Center in 2013, during which Dr. Kapila Vatsyayan stood up twice to praise it and blessed me most dramatically, a gesture I will never forget. ARCE created many archival events for public outreach, training and applied archiveology, inspired by materials that scholars had deposited. One was Remembered Rhythms, an academic conference in February 2005 featuring 3 diasporic communities of India, followed by educational performance tours of the 3 traditions throughout the nation. I was fortunate to lead one such Remembered Rhythms tour with the Goma, African Indian Sufis of Gujarat, based on my prior AIIS Senior Research Fellowship research. The 12 CB men told me that it was their greatest tour experience ever, even beyond their international tour with me, because for the first time they were shown respect in their own country. This was followed by more respect, and it strengthened the CB community. We gave lectures and workshops during the tour to reveal an untaught history of Africans in India for students, scholars, and the general public. The tour reached 7 major universities and metros, and ARCE's Shubha Chaudhuri and Tony Seeger then created the Remembered Rhythms book through Seagull Press, with CD examples and video DVDs and audio CDs of the 3 groups. Dr. S.A. Krishnaya, a folklorist who's collaborated with us in the Baka restudy in Karnataka several times, beginning in 1984, and continues to take the restudy project forward. We collaborated with him at the puppeteers Baka had filmed and photographed in 1938, after which he has conducted many restudies inspired by Baka's Tefi recordings. That Mysore puppetry restudy led to the recovery and digitization of the Halare puppetry manuscript Raja Satya Harishchandra, a version of the Mahabharata tale, retold in Yakshagana style for Gombayatha string puppeteers and musicians to perform. Another Baka restudy in Kerala is currently being conducted by Mappila Muslim historians at PSMO College in Malappuram district. When I played back and repatriated the recordings to PSMO College and Calicut University in 2018, they were shocked to realize that many of Baka's 25 Mappila recordings could hardly be recognized, as the styles had changed and they had evidently been lost. Baka's recordings inspired the Mappila scholars to restudy and relearn the lost materials and to create the Baka-Jairazbhoy Chair for Indian Ocean Studies at PSMO College, Departments of History and Migration Studies, with a new audiovisual archive for which I suggested that ARCE be consulted. Simultaneously, Mark Aranya, a graduate student at South Africa College of Music of the University of Cape Town, was receiving guidance from the ARCE and PSMO College and had accessed our field materials using Baka's recordings of Jews and Mappilas at ARCE. He completed his master's thesis in ethnomusicology entitled Jews and Mappilas of Kerala, a study of their history and selected song traditions. Mr. Aranya is now conducting PhD research in Kerala with Mappilas and Cochin Jews for his degree at University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, South Africa. He plans to use the Baka restudy methodology in his dissertation research. He and Professor Herbst each spoke recently for the international lecture series
9 minutes, Amy.
of the Baka restudy of the Baka-Jairazbhoy Chair for Indian Ocean Studies at PSMO College. Speakers include Indian Ocean experts in ethnomusicology, anthropology, and linguistics. UCLA Ethnomusicology is currently working on a project with the UCLA Digital Library to create the Baka-Jairazbhoy Digital Archive of South Asian Traditional Music and Arts. We're currently working on updating and revising the metadata and creating links between the still images, the moving images, and the audio recordings. The Baka-Jairazbhoy still images are currently online, but the metadata updates for the images have not yet been loaded. You can view the still images at the links shown, and we hope to have the Jairazbhoy moving images and audio recordings online within the next few months. With gratitude to Arnold Adrian Baca, Nazir Ali Jairazbhoy, ARCE, AIIS, UCLA Ethnomusicology, and PSMO College History and Migration Studies departments. Ever since first discussing plans for an archive in India with Nazir Jairazbhoy in 1976, ARCE has been a major asset in my research, my life, in my collaborators' lives, in their communities, and the music and musicians of India for nearly 50 years.
10 minutes.
After 4 brilliant decades, I hope ARCE will continue with the vision and creativity and leadership, institutional and professional support, and social applications that have enabled ARCE to make a truly unique impact on community and the world. Thank you all for your attention and for carrying the project forward.
Thank you, Amy. Thank you very much. How I hate to be the timekeeper.
Thank you.
Thank you. We now have Shubha Chaudhuri. Shubha is the Associate Director General Academic of the American Institute of Indian Studies and has worked at the ARCE since its inception and has been the director since 1985. Shubha is a member of the International Association of Sound and Audiovisual Archives, Research Archives Section, and Training and Education Committee. Shubha, I now invite you.
Thank you, Purnima. Well, our job as panelists was to respond to Dan's paper, which we fortunately all had the opportunity of reading before, since he couldn't present all of it. But listening to Bonnie and Amy, there are so many other points that come to mind that we could have addressed, or that I could have addressed in trying to deal with this in 10 minutes is going to be difficult. So I'm really grateful for all the inputs that we have got through the other presentations. Well, Dan's paper brings to mind the early years very vividly, the challenges, the problems, and also, as we see now, the achievements. And sometimes we get we were so worried about all the problems and challenges we were facing that we would have to remind ourselves that it was also a great deal of fun. The early years were a great deal of fun. When we think back, audiovisual archiving and ethnomusicology were both not established fields, as we've already discussed about ethnomusicology. So the expertise that we could draw upon or models in India were very few, if at all existed. So we had to rely very early on international expertise and think of it in those days without the internet, without easy access to information, how every manual of bit of equipment that Uma wanted to refer to or any kind of information was just so much harder to come by. We had, thanks to Nazir's vision, a lot of advantages when we started out. One was that right in 1982, we knew we were a computer-based archive. That was early years of the PC. We started with Nazir's Apple II, for which he developed a system. With those days, we didn't talk about metadata, we talked about retrieval systems. And then, of course, Dan has in his paper how we moved on to the PC and using Paradox, which I shall come back to. But we knew, though we were working, we tried to work with cards for a few years and so on. We, from the beginning, were working towards a computer-based retrieval, which is a very important aspect of the archives right from its inception. The other was that we started with legal agreement forms, which were based on other international archives. So unlike a lot of archives, we were not stuck with legacy materials for which we had no idea of rights, but we had agreements based on, for which depositors could choose the degree of access. Now that has given us a lot of opportunities to work with the materials. We have, of course, moved on in many ways. So what I wanted to say, and I think Umashankar is going to do the same, that a lot of decisions which were made in the early years have actually stayed with us in ways that as we have developed and grown, but the roots were all there in that first 5 years. So we've also had the advantage of getting very involved in training, thanks to the Ford Foundation. And because, as I said, there were so few people doing anything of audiovisual archiving or ethnomusicology and related fields like folklore, performing arts, and so on. With support from Ford Foundation, we got involved in training very early, with Nazir holding the first audio training workshop as early as 1983. And the other conferences that have been already mentioned. But that allowed us to become part of a very active network of Indian institutions and archives. And eventually, we ended up leading for 10 years something called the Archives Resource Community, which was again funded by the Ford Foundation, a network organization of audiovisual archives. So those were kind of advantages of being there very early. The paradox that we moved to in 1986 was a relational database. We also used it for all our early Rajasthan data that Dan has had in his paper about what we call the Rajasthan Atlas project. It is a nested set of relational tables and a database structure that we've been able to modify and grow, and then more recently been able to incorporate current metadata standards. So needless to say that all of us who were there in the early years learned on the job. None of us had any exposure to audiovisual archiving or to ethnomusicology, but had some connections in some ways, which led to us being hired. Now, it's interesting that today, I think we have moved along a bit, but it still remains a field where people learn on the job. And somehow it didn't feel very difficult when we visited other archives all over the world. I found most of my colleagues said, well, they learned on the job. So we didn't feel that isolated. So through the years, the support of the international community through the YASA, the Society of Ethnomusicology, and ICTM, both of which had committees focused on archives, we learned a lot, and we learned to develop our own vision of what it meant to be an ethnomusicology archive in India. Each of our chairs, who've been named already, contributed their own vision that has helped us to grow till today. The first fieldwork project mentioned by Dan in his paper with Komal Kothari and Rupayan Sansthan, it's a relationship that went back a long way, as we see from the field notes of Nazir-Jairazbhoy, our founder, with whom he made recordings as far back in 1978. He also had a very close relationship with our first director, Ashok Ranade, but that got an institutional shape with what we call the Rajasthan Atlas project. It was the start of what was to be a long relationship and many projects. Our current approach towards community archives or collaborative archiving has its roots in that project as well, where we trained young musicians to collect data, as well as the attitude we developed and the relationships with the community of musicians that lasts till today. We have field notes of Nazir where he discusses with Komal Kothari about Rupayan collections to be deposited in ARCE. Finally, very recently, with grants from the Endangered Archives Program of the British Library and the Modern Endangered Archives Program of UCLA, we have worked in a collaborative projects of digitizing the Rupayan Sansthan collection. I would like to end with thanking Director General Dr. Pradeep Mendirata and our Director General today, Purnima Mehta, and all the presidents especially the support from Edward Dimmock in the early years to Sumati Ramaswamy today, along with all our chairs and the committee members who have really helped us to be where we are today. Thank you.
Thank you, Shubha. We still had 2.5 minutes for you.
Wow, I was a little worried, but I would like to take the opportunity of being online just now to say, since we had to miss Dan's slides,
Yes.
I could maybe share the screen and show them now if I have 2.5 minutes.
Yes, thank you. Dan,
If,
is that okay with you? Maybe you can speak while Shubha shows the PowerPoint. I think she has a copy of your PowerPoint.
Dan is muted.
Yep, okay, yeah, of course.
Thank
And most of them are self-explanatory, but go for it.
Well, I just open it and then share the screen. Yeah. Well, we have to say that we did a trial with Dan before the session and it all worked perfectly.
Yeah.
And then suddenly it didn't work
It
at the
didn't.
time. And
Shall I try from this end?
I am now, yeah, 1 second.
Can you see me?
Yes.
Yes, we can see
Okay.
actually.
Yes.
I think it'll go, so this is the brief slideshow. And it'll go 5 seconds each picture automatically. That's Nazir, of course. And this is where he's cracking the coconut in Pune with Ashok and Amy right behind him. And here you can see Pradeep and Francine. Many of you may not know Francine, was years ago in Ashok Ranade. And this was either the first or second conference. Shubha, do you remember which one?
The first one, 1984.
Yeah, and that's B29, where we settled until we moved to Gurgaon. And that was the expanded committee in 1987. And this was the Text, Tones, and Tunes with Bonnie and Albert Lord. And there's Umashankar, I think very happy with all that equipment that was coming in. These are some shots from the Rajasthan Atlas project. And this was a meeting that we had in 1992. This is where my slideshow ends with the whole committee. And that's it. So that was fast. I made it very quick.
Thank you. This was invaluable. I'm glad we could bring it up and see all the slides. Thank you so much.
Sure.
We now have Umashankar. Umashankar is a well-known sound recordist and a pioneer in the field in India. He was one of the initial team of the Archives and Research Center for Ethnomusicology of the AIIS and served as technical officer for many years. His current work is with ambisonic microphones and acoustic measuring of archaeological sites. Uma retains his interest in archiving and remains involved with the ARCE, providing training and consultation. Uma, over to you for 10 minutes.
But you see, basically, I wanted to do a bridge from where Dan had finished in his paper, not where he spoke, to the current status of the archives. Primarily, two things happened. Both Dan and Shubha had concentrated on the database side of things, computers used for database. We had the other side was, digitization. Now ARC is more or less completely digital archives. We have physical tapes, but we don't have to access them because we have digital copies of everything. And those are accessed through the databases that we have. And that had earlier an early form of digital, which was using videotape and a machine called the PCMF1. So the earliest recordings in that format were actually Barkay's wax cylinders, which were copied to this format. And we have five PCM tapes with the Barkay's material. That is probably the earliest digital material ARC has. We did, after that, when we got our own PCM F1 machine, we had off and on digitized material using that. And those about 2,000 hours worth of recordings have mostly now been converted to the next format, which is a hard disk based WAV files. Like all the other material that's slowly been moved, whether it was analog or digital being PCM and then DAT and CDs or data CD, all those have slowly bit by bit moved to a hard disk archive. And for that, we had to go through 3 steps. One was a very early primitive A to D converter. I think it was probably realistic. I don't remember the name. And the first serious A to D converter was Lake People, which we still have. It doesn't work very well. And then we moved on to digital audio Denmark. We bought the lowest cost machine, which still costs a few $1,000s. But now we have a more expensive version, which we have so far enabled only 4 tracks. We can enable 8 channels, but we have enabled 4 because we don't need more than that. And that is the digitization part was fairly simple. We just had to buy the right equipment. But there are going to be problems because the new computers don't have, can't take the cards with which we can transfer the data, because earlier data transfer was all done using AIS-EB connectors. Now everybody is using USB, and these A to D converters we have will not give USB output. So we'll have to go on. But basically, we have managed from 2000 to 2022 using these machines. The other was right from the beginning, the very first time we were doing any digitization, was the realization that we will have to have large hard disk systems, digital mass storage. And our very first one was 5 GB. We're quite pleased with 5 GB and 8 hard disks. So if hard disk failed, we could replace it. It's called a RAID system. From that, we have moved on. Now we have, I don't even know how much we have, about 100 and odd TB of hard disk. And that is, see, once we had gone to that stage of digital mass storage, the audio technology is not very relevant for these things because they can be done by any computer trained storage person. So that way it is easier because you just digitize and forward the digital files to the mass storage system, and managing the mass storage is not the problem of the audio technician. Whereas earlier, in the beginning days, whether it was a RAID with 5 GB of file space, the technician needed to know how it worked, needed to know how to replace the hard disk. All that is no longer important. That's all I actually wanted to bring it, because with Nazir, with Dan bringing in the whole hard disk system and all that, PCM was the first digital thing we did, and we now do very standard 4896, 2496 files, and we can do, and we have a fairly automated system for doing that. But the technician's job is actually to make sure the analog side works well, and that is beginning to become more and more difficult. We have one working school recorder, and we have to go on finding equipment to continue, because it's not as if we have finished digitizing everything we have in the archive, so we don't need analog machine. That's not the way it works, because, for instance, the Rupa and Simstan collections are all analog recordings. They have to, that's why we needed the new cassette decks, because a lot of the material is on cassette decks. So we will get collections which are analog. So we need to have reliable, good machines. That's not so easy to do anymore. Okay, I'll stop there. whether I've done 10 minutes or not.
No. 5.5 minutes.
That's okay.
Do you want to take some more time?
No, I said what I wanted to say.
Okay.
I didn't turn the picture on because my signal is very poor here. I'm happy you are able to hear what I say.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
You know, I might add one thing, which is in my original paper, and neither Uma or Shubha mentioned, I think, and that is Shubha managed to get us on ERNet in the very early years before the internet became commonly available. And so, no, you're on my video too. And so we did have access to the international world via the internet at a very early time. Shubha, I don't remember what year that was, maybe 96, 97, or maybe even earlier.
A little earlier than that, because by 96, 97, we had internet in India. Not very good, but...
Dan, it was, I think, 92, 91 or 92, right after the project. I remember sending map files across to you.
Oh, right.
Yeah, on ERNet, yes.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah. So that was another, in a way, the archive, and it's a point you were making, was kind of pioneering. Shubha managed to make friends with people who eventually became very, very wealthy, because we used to buy PC boxes from these basically garage outfits. They were assembling PCs, again, in the mid 80s. And then within 3-4 years, some of these individuals became rather large, wealthy entrepreneurs. That's it.
Thank you. Amy, I see your hand raised. Is there anything you'd like to say?
Well, thank you. Yes, Umashankar said that you're in need of reliable, good machines for the older technologies. Now, we have a couple of, or maybe 3 TIACs, but they have to be in good condition, and it's very difficult to find people here who work on such things. I'm wondering if it would be of any good to ship them to you for repair in India. Would that?
Getting a little too old. 5 years ago, I would have said I will open it up, but now.
Okay.
There are places in Los Angeles where you can get these old machines repaired.
Yeah, Los Angeles is a good place.
Okay, I'll look into that. Thanks. Also, about the PCM, you said that the cylinders were transferred onto PCM. Now, we made field recordings using the PCM in what was really.
That's right. Yeah.
CE's
yeah, I don't know. They never came to ARCE.
Yes, Uma, we have a lot of PCMs.
But not of the Bakhe recordings.
No, not the Bakhe restudy.
The
Some were
Bakhe,
done.
yes, the Bakhe.
Some were done on the PCM. Yes.
Restudy was where Nadir started using PCM.
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
And I think it was the first time.
You can buy old PCM F1 boxes. I have one.
But the trouble,
we have 2 here. They work, and the only thing is we have only one adapter which allows the PCM signal to be turned into SDIF, and that unfortunately the company that made it doesn't exist anymore.
well, that we're having trouble at UCLA to transfer those PCM recordings so that they can be put on the digital archive.
Yeah, we have managed to transfer about 2,000 hours.
Well, we should send them to you.
But we have a machine that will do it.
Lot left to digitize.
Huh?
So we still have a lot left to digitize. I wish we were as caught up as you think we were, because more material has been.
No, PCM we are more.
Also analog. There's a lot of analog. But
no, analog I'm not talking about at all. I know, because we just got the cassette decks to do them. So it will take a while to get more.
Well, thank you very much for the very enlightening and interesting discussions. Early years seem to be just yesterday, and so much work has gone in. Thank you very much. I think it's time now to open our session for discussion for question answers. So we are happy to take any questions from audience.
Through the chat. Yeah.
Through the chat box, through the question answers.
Alan is on, I think. I don't see the chat box. Yeah.
It is.
I'm looking at the chat box. It just seems to be us.
Yeah. Well,
Yes.
Yeah.
just check.
There is question answers also, Q&A as well.
Yes.
That's what I'm looking.
Shivam, can you please allow permissions for Q&A?
Yes, please. Yeah.
Oh, yes, you opened it.
So for participants who are on right now, they can go into the chat mode and ask questions. I don't think you need permission for that.
With,
You
Tony.
can also use the Q&A. Yes.
Yes, I think we have one question from Tony for Dan.
Oh, right.
That to
you
all
know,
of us, or?
At that time, not that I'm aware of, or if they were, I'm either not aware of it or I don't remember. But Bonnie, do you remember anything else like this? I think ARCE was the only thing that I'm aware of that at least came through.
Yes, that's true.
Remember, the PL 480 funds were limited to a number of countries: Egypt, India, maybe 5, Tunisia, 3, 4 other countries. So with respect to that program at the Smithsonian, it was limited to those countries, and I believe that the only archive proposal was for India.
I think there was something in the works in but maybe it never got completed.
That's my memory is the same as yours, Dan, and I remember how important it was when I think it was on Ford Foundation funds. Shubha went to a conference. Where was that conference? Was it in Africa? Shubha, help me here. I'm having memory problems too. You went, and it was quite important that you had accomplished so much at the ARCE, and other countries were learning how to proceed to do such a thing. Do you remember that?
Yes. Thank you, Bonnie. I think quite a few of us had been invited to Sudan. I think that's what you are thinking of.
Sudan, yes, Sudan.
Yes. And then from Jihad and so on, a lot of people were there. And then Tony and I remain involved and with the Archive of Traditional Music of Sudan at the time, which was a Ford-funded outfit. And we went there, I think, 4 times, helping them to get going. And again, Ford connection, I did a lot of consulting with Ford Indonesia, with archives in Indonesia at the time. So yeah, I think some of them, I think, were a bit like Sudan and so on, were thinking of, repatriating collections and so on. But this was largely helping people to set up archives and research archives, is one of the areas that I know we got identified with. Thank you, Bunny.
We have a question here. Is it okay if I speak up that question?
Please.
This is a question. It says, I'd like to know who at the Ford Foundation supported or encouraged the establishment of ARCE.
Well, I do remember the name. Though it's somebody I never met because it was there in the earliest papers with meetings with Dr. Ranadi and Nazir, was Carolyn Elliott, who gave us the first grant that enabled ARCE to start, actually. So that being along with the Smithsonian, because the Smithsonian was only rupees, And the first Ford grant helped us to equip ourselves entirely. So some of the equipment is there right till today, because we got set up for a full archival setup in Pune and in Delhi, since we had 2 units as well as field equipment. So though I don't think much of it is working, but that was our first grant, was Carolyn Elliott. But there were a lot of program officers who supported us in the years that followed with equipment grants, as Sumati already mentioned, Remembered Rhythms, where she was the program officer. Many program officers right till Ravina Agarwal. So I don't think actually it's fair to name anyone. The higher education and culture program of Ford Foundation, while it was there, was a great source for us.
Thank you, Shubha. We have a comment that says, my computer says chat disabled. Well, Q&A is enabled, just so you know. So this comment goes on to say, I don't have a question, but I'm so inspired by the morning papers. Thank you all. Just wanted to share this. Here's another one. Thank you all for this session. What kinds of recordings did Nazir seek to collect in the archive? Only live music performance or studio type recordings and interviews as well? Many times ethnographers would have all kinds of extraneous recordings, not necessarily relevant to their particular research program. Would he have included all these in his vision for the archive?
Well, yes, lot of interviews for sure. I think Amy knows and Uma knows here. The interviews and everything was live field recordings. So that's another thing that we've always, been followed. So all our projects we've dealt with have been field recordings done by Dan later, by us later. So yes, and we did decide to, we always had interviews or other activities that were going around about music making around it. It's not just always the performance.
So this is a question that Max Katz asked, and he also asked about studio recordings, which I imagine if there were studio recordings, I'm not sure exactly what he means by that, but I'm sure they would have been included, certainly not excluded. The other thing we haven't actually talked about, I remember that we were embarked on trying to get a collection to digitize of all old 78 RPM recordings. Remember?
Yes, we
and
did.
So that was also part of what we were trying to do. I don't know how far we got with that. Shubha?
Yes, we kind of announced that program, and we attracted a lot of donations. So we have a sizable collection of 78 RPM records. And you remember you helped us get all the specialized stylus and all this equipment to be able to play them back. And Umashankar has digitized some, but it's like everything else, we are thoroughly, behind in being able to achieve it all. But we have the right playback equipment, at least for the 78s. And I think we have at least 1,000, if not more.
Oh my goodness, I'm remembering now, Brian Silver had a huge collection of 78 recordings. And for a while he was involved with the AIISIST. I was very disappointed when he decided to donate his entire collection on retirement to the Harvard library. But I wonder if some cooperative venture might go forth.
We do have a lot of 78.
Brian is on, by the way.
Brian is registered.
Brian,
yes.
Hello, Brian. I was so disappointed and a little mad at you when you decided to donate to Harvard.
Well, he did talk to us and he said he felt better about it being in the US.
Yes, I know. I heard it all.
There's another question. Yeah.
There's another question from Zoe Sharinian. This is for you, Bonnie.
Yeah.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Zoe, I read it in chat. Why did I shift my focus toward classical music? Well, I had a Fulbright. I had funding. I wanted to be in India. I wanted to learn as much as I could about whatever I could. And it was clear that I could not bring that folk music project to fruition. I would, when you go to a village wedding, you, well, in the first place, you go into a private home in the village, and all the women from the village, or many of them, not just family, are gathered in there. And in the rituals, this is taking place in this corner, and around a wall, there are things happening in another corner. And it was just a very active, complex logistical problem. And if I wanted to record songs, these songs were not being sung necessarily by the people right around the groom where some kind of ritual action was taken. There were instances where a woman in the village who was known for a grand repertoire of wedding songs would be invited to come participate in this, and she would sit in one spot. So if I wanted to record the songs, I had to be in one spot in order to do that. It had to be a team project. There was just no way. Video-wise, people who knew about the references in the songs, of course, I could have done that later, but by that time it was just, it was overwhelming. People had to tell me the references in the song texts to particular family members. It was just very complex, and it had to be done by a team. One thing I did learn from it was that you could, an anthropologist interested in marriage patterns and people moving from one place to another because it was village exogamy, you could literally trace through the music which songs were taken with the women who would sing them in the village they moved to when they married. So it was a very fruitful possibility for tracking patterns of movement among families and caste, et cetera, et cetera. So it was a good project. But I only had 9 months from Fulbright, and I had to do a dissertation project, and I loved the classical Cal. And so I was affiliated with Delhi University, which had a very fine school of music. And I could quickly get assigned to a vocal teacher and study the singing. I was very serious about that at the time. And so that's why I went into the classical music. I never regretted the shift. Also, things were technologically, we're talking about technology being difficult in the archive. It was difficult in the field. I was loaned a Nagra, a very great gift from the UCLA Ethnomusicology program. So I went off to India with this Nagra, which was a very sophisticated movie industry machine, which required 12 D-size batteries to run on. And I was told before I went that in India, it is at this point, it is very difficult to get fresh batteries. Batteries, if you go to the store to buy a battery, it has probably been sitting there for months, dying. So even if you purchased many, many batteries, you couldn't really be sure what you were buying. So it was arduous in the extreme. And so I had a little ewer, which I used for portability, but I also had this Nagra, which had to be ported, and the extra batteries that I took. I also did a project in Benares. The Maharaja was very interested in having a research project done on his Ramayana festival. And I was invited by, oh my goodness, his name just went right out of my head. Oh, I do apologize, but I've reached that age. The man who wrote the book on drama forms. So frustrating. Somebody jump in. Anyway, he invited me to come to record the soundscape, and also there was a cluster of singers who would be right in front of the Maharaja's elephant when the Maharaja went out to observe the festival every night. And they would chant the story, which was being enacted on a stage quite distant from where he was. I had a Nagra, and I realized, you know, logistically speaking, this is another thing. They wanted to put me on an elephant. And so I was on an elephant right behind the Maharaja's elephant. And anytime I wanted to record anything, I had to get down off the elephant with my Nagra, with my extra batteries. And of course, getting down off the elephant was just, they had to lower the elephant. I had to keep my battle. Oh, it was just ridiculous. So I said, I'm staying off the elephant. I'm going to walk with the people on the dusty field as we went from scene to scene and record what I can. And I got recordings. I got recordings of the Ramayani who were singing the story that was being enacted. And I got what I think are fantastic contextual recordings of what it was like to be in the crowd, to hear the very distant enactment of the Ramayana story that was going on quite far. And the Nagra was sensitive enough that you could pick it up. I had good equipment. But then the batteries went. I was carrying a bag of 12D size batteries, and I couldn't stop in the middle of this crowd very safely to change batteries. And so I just stopped at one point, decided I got to do it, opened the container for the batteries, dumped the whole thing out on the ground, threw new batteries into the machine, closed it up, and went on. But you know, those things were logistically very, very difficult. And I sent a copy of the recordings that I made to the Maharaja himself. I never got any recognition or thanks to be sure that they got to him, and I don't know what happened to them afterwards. But I think I deposited that at UCLA. Remember, this is 1968 by then. And UCLA wanted, just let me finish the sentence. UCLA wanted anyone who went anywhere to immediately archive their recording at UCLA. And so it was done. So it exists, and it may be in the ARCE collection now. I've also donated there as well.
Thank you. Thank you, Bonnie. We have 4 more questions, and I'll quickly read them out. From Mark. His question is, what direction, activities, and ventures do you foresee or would you like to see for the archive in the next few years?
That's a huge question, and not
4 minutes, 3 minutes.
Not a 3-4 minute question. We hope to continue. Really, a focus has to be to get fully digital. We're not anywhere there yet. And we look forward to doing more field work projects, which are, you know, we've been working more with the community archiving or collaborative approach. We would like to do that. But really, I think we're going to have to focus on our digitization and being able to get more of our materials more accessible. So I think that is in brief.
Thank you, Shubha.
There are always lots of plans and lots of dreams.
We have 3 more questions, and I see that we have hands raised from Andrew Alter and Sanjay Watts. Quickly from Dipanjali, I was wondering if Dan or Bonnie could elaborate a little more on what you said about ethnomusicology being considered a pejorative term back then. How was it a challenge for ARCE India, if it was at all?
First thing, very few people actually knew the word. So we're talking about a very limited circle, but within that limited circle, it was associated with the study of so-called primitive and folk music, people who were at all familiar with the term. Remember, Bruno Nettle's first book was something along the lines of music of primitive people. So I think it was considered pejorative in that sense. We aren't primitive, we have our great tradition. And they're focusing, of course, on their classical art traditions. But I don't think it was a problem for ARCE in the beginning. One of the challenges was to make sure that actual performing classical musicians learned to trust ARCE. I remember I had in one of my slideshows a photograph of Ram Narayan and Zia Mohyuddin Dagar, who visited the archives, and I did that to ensure them that we weren't stealing their music. This was a different concern. But I don't think overall this was a major challenge at the beginning, because most of the people who deposited their collections were foreigners. I think Indian scholars in ethnomusicology, so-called, came a little later.
Oh, Dan, I think if I can come in here, it was a problem. We would keep hearing this about, you're doing such good work. Why do you call yourself ethnomusicology? We had people who thought exactly what you said, that a lot of people would say ethnomusicology is foreigners studying Indian music, or they want to equate our classical music to all kinds of primitive traditions. So there was some of that. And I think our 84 conference dealt with that. We had a whole session, Bonnie would remember, called the Ethno Concept, where we had a note from Bruno and then taken on by Tara Lingson and Tony to talk about, what the ethno meant in ethnomusicology. So I think it was there, but it was interesting how it has stopped being an issue. And same people sometimes who criticized are today using it very freely. In fact, too freely, and ways that are not always accurate to what the discipline is.
Yeah.
Thank you, Shubha. We still, it's 1 minute past 9 p.m. We still have Sanjay Watts. Sanjay, your hand is raised. Did you want to say something? I think it's muted somehow.
You'll have to unmute.
Sanjay ji, please unmute yourself. We have allowed permission.
Okay, we have Brian Silver. Brian, I see. Yeah, go ahead, please. Ishan, somehow.
Sorry, I just saw the unmute. Good morning, everyone. This is a wonderful and exciting conference, and I'm delighted to be participating. Just very briefly, I respond to Bonnie in a note in the chat so as not to take.
Mute. He can't find the unmute.
More later, but I see exciting possibilities for collaboration with Harvard, no question.
Oh.
Okay, thank you. Sanjay, are you still muted?
Sanjay ji, you can unmute yourself and speak.
Okay, while we are waiting, this is another question from an anonymous attendee. Would it be possible to have a virtual common pool of archives across the world from where scholars can access research material? We also have while you're considering that, there's a question from Alan Burdett.
Good evening all, and thanks to give me an opportunity to ask. And I listen carefully, Ma'am Chaudhuri, regarding the stories and all, and it is really enhanced my knowledge. I really thankful to all, and thankful to Kamalni ma'am who give me an opportunity to join you, ma'am. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Sanjay. From Alan, looking back to the vision you had for the archive in the beginning, in what ways is the archive today different from that vision, and or what achievements match that vision? I think this cannot be a short, brief response.
Oh, well, I tried to deal with that a little bit in responding to Dan's paper, but I will deal with it a little more in the next session when we talk about acquisition and repatriation. So I think things did change a little, but we have really stuck the course for most of what we have done.
Yes, I think it's time now to close this session. Very enlightening and interesting, but we need to start our second session in about 17 minutes from now. So thank you very much, everybody. Thank you very much. We start now. The second session is at 9:20 p.m. India Standard Time.
Kamlini ji, I think you can come on.
Namaste. Greetings from India to all of you.
I think we're just waiting for Amlan and Valmont to come on as well.
Mr. Amlan is here, ma'am.
Yeah, I know. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. All right.
Am I audible?
Yes, yes.
Can you hear me? So I send greetings from India to all of you in a week-long festival, a grand festival of the year, Deepavali, and an extended 2-3 days of celebration. I congratulate ARCE on the 40th anniversary and American Institute of Indian Studies for the 60th anniversary. I owe a lot to ARCE, which I'll be speaking about just in a very short introduction. I am basically a dancer to begin with and a musician. And I joined Doordarshan much later when I was 21-year-old and as a program producer. All my colleagues here, participants and specialists, have dedicated their lives passionately to archiving. My archiving years in Doordarshan that period was short, 10 years only. But I think I started pre-archiving work much earlier because without content, we cannot archive. So I was a program producer. Doordarshan, when I joined, was still in very nascent stage. We were making programs in black and white and with rudimentary equipment in makeshift studios. But we were very enthusiastic. This black and white period was almost for 20 years. We shifted to color in 1982. After that, there was a rapid change in technology. From BCN 1-inch, which was used for studio production, we had camcorders for field work, and the camcorders rapidly changed, like from U-matic to beta, and later on, when I joined Archives, the current technology was DVC Pro. DVC Pro, though it may sound digital, but it behaved like an analog only because it was a tape. Tape is a tape only, and it was linear and real time. So it was not a file. Well, when I joined Archives, I was given the task of transferring 2 lakh assets, 200,000 assets. And the progress was very slow because the machines, the older machines like Ampex Quad for the black and white and BCN machines were already gone, and we had only a couple of machines still working. But the people who knew the technology, they had already retired and gone. So the work was really very slow. And it would have taken us another 100 years to transfer everything. But still, we can't help because except beta, nothing was compatible to any system in which we can ingest and make files. Anyway, in 2008, we got our media asset management. And thanks to ARCE, when I was really looking for a solution, how to manage these archives, and just transferring tape formats is not going to make an archives. It is a library, all right. And in register or in a computer, we have some information about the tape, what it contains, but that's not archives. So it was a chance meeting with Shubha, and she offered a wonderful training for a few people, and I joined that training. And that helped me. It was a basic understanding on how to archive audiovisual content, intangible content. It is not a book or any artifact which we can read, even after digitization, we can reach out. Here, it doesn't happen like that. So she told me in that training, ARCE training, that file is the only way you can preserve for long. File also has migration problems, but then it is not so slow as coming from analog to digital. That's one thing. And the files, once you create files, what is more important is creating metadata. Otherwise, you don't retrieve anything. In Doordarshan archives, Doordarshan is basically concerned with program making and broadcasting. So our archives was only given a secondary preference. It was treated as a backyard management. Now it's no more like that. Once you are in digital world, it cannot be a backyard management. And it is not only for the people who are accessing it from a Doordarshan family, like, the producers coming to archives and asking for clips, requesting for clips and excerpts, or the researchers coming and sitting and watching the programs for their support for the research. No, it is a parallel activity already on the digital platforms. So it is a push and pull technology. It gives the viewer a chance to watch the content anytime and anywhere. So that's the challenge. So Doordarshan is slowly moving towards that. We are already on YouTube, but that's not the greatest solution, I think, because it doesn't have the complete metadata. It just gives a one-liner or two lines. So now coming back to this, that we are like any other public service broadcasting, and we are government supported. So we have our own constraints and also the benefit of being supported by the government, government funding, I mean, we don't have to look for commercial gains. So we can be focusing on our work for posterity. That's what we began to do. Now, of course, with YouTube and other ways, of course, I did disseminate programs on CDs and DVDs for my own bosses to understand, hold that content and understand that this is the value, this is the worth. We have such wonderful cultural assets that we should be disseminating, we should reach out, and reaching out should be the purpose of archive. Just not putting it in a file format or waiting for some producer to come and ask for it. The difference between BBC or NHK and Doordarshan is one main thing. We generate content 24 hours in 20 languages. And then we have such variety of cultural treasure in India that we have to engage experts for doing metadata, and only a few will not help. Like sitting here in Delhi, nobody can write the metadata for any Northeast cultural content. The languages are different. The ethnicity of that cultural content is totally different. So we engage subject expert to do the metadata. And it has to be really very deep, because the purpose of using it, repurposing we call, the repurposing of that content will depend on what kind of metadata you have already created and put in collision with with the content which is there in the metadata, in the media asset management. The media asset management is Delhi supported, and that allows you free open fields for putting metadata, and the content and metadata move together. So they are not sitting in two different machines. So that's one gain, big gain we got in Doordarshan archives. Now, I would like to also mention here that the topic of today's session is acquisition and repatriation. This basically sounds like very, very important topic for ethnomusicology research and archives, but we see it from a different angle. Media archives don't do any special acquisition, or nobody comes and deposits programs in archives. It is a flow from what has been broadcast to reaching to the archives, because whatever has been broadcast will have minimum data, minimum metadata, and then it will be pushed to archives where we have to reorganize the metadata for future use, imagining what can be the request from any producer of our organization or from any other organization. The only good thing about media assets is that because it is broadcast material, the standards are very high and the technical standards are very high, keeping in mind the signal losses which happen during the broadcast. Now, of course, it is digital and much of it is not lost. But when we started, it was all for 40, 30, 35, 40 years. It was all analog only. Only in the first decade of this century, we have got digital. So the standards of analog technical standards of the content is very high. But where we failed was to preserve them in proper environment. So whatever we created in a very, very high standard, we lost it to a certain extent because the environment in which it was preserved was not good and we were not aware of it. So now a proper 24-hour AC, that also I learned from ARCE only, that you have to put your tapes in 24-hour AC. It may sound like, teaching a primary school student, but then that was it, because we were not archivists and entire Doordarshan did not have an awareness of archives. So now it is in 24-hour AC, and also 45-degree humidity is controlled. Central archives should not be kept in Delhi, because Delhi is a very, very difficult weather climatic condition, extreme, both cold, and it should be in a place where it is moderate. Now in Delhi, I've seen for the last 10, 15 years, the humidity is also very high. Earlier, it was a dry place. Anyway, coming back to the topic of acquisition and repatriation, it is not exactly giving back to the community from where it has come. It goes back in the form of broadcasting or CD, DVD, in the form of reaching out to a larger community which loves that music, dance, or whatever content we have created. This media archives are covering all the subjects. It's not news archives. It's not entertainment archives. It is about the country. It is every moment of what is happening in the country in every sphere. Now, I'll put an end to it because I don't want to go on and on. I am passionate about archiving, but I want to hear from today's speaker what he would be saying on the paper which he has already submitted, and I have gone through the paper in detail. Wonderful, sensitive paper. And I think the artists, the archivists should have that kind of responsibility and ethical responsibility, if I may add so, towards dealing, when they are dealing with ethnomusicology archives. I mean, not only that, but that it is more, because you are dealing with sensitive communities. That's what he has tried to present. I will later on, after listening to him, I will also mention certain catch lines which has caught my imagination. Now, I will be introducing Anthony Seeger, who is the paper presenter of the session. Anthony Seeger is an anthropologist, ethnomusicologist, and audiovisual archivist. He served as a director of the Indiana University Archives of Traditional Music, curator and director of Smithsonian Folkways Recordings, and has served as the chair of AIIS Ethnomusicology Committee. He has published an audiovisual archives intellectual property. He has published on audiovisual archives, intellectual property, Brazilian Indian music, and other subjects. He co-edited with Shubha Chaudhuri of Archives for the Future Global Perspective on Audiovisual Archives in the 21st Century, 2004. And the contribution of reconfigured audiovisuals to sustaining traditions in 2015. He is former president of the Society for Ethnomusicology and the International Council for Traditional Music. He is now Distinguished Professor of Ethnomusicology Emeritus at UCLA and Director and Curator Emeritus of Smithsonian Folkways Recordings at the Smithsonian Institute. Welcome, Anthony Seeger. Please take over the session.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, for the introduction and also for your observations on broadcast archives, which are distinctive in how they're organized and what their purposes are. I'm going to start with a song. Come, you ladies and you gentlemen, listen to my song. I'll sing it to you right, but you might think it wrong. It may make you mad, but I mean no harm. It's about acquisitions and repatriation. Hot times in the archives in 2022. Yes, it's hot times in the archives in ARC's 40th year. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and wherever you may be. The first panel this morning discussed the origins of the Archives and Research Center for Ethnomusicology at the American Institute of Indian Studies 40 years ago. And I want to thank M.Neuman for his paper, Sumathi Ramaswamy for her opening, and Purnima Mehta for her very strict timekeeping. And I think it's important to keep us strictly timed, because otherwise we won't have the interesting discussions at the end that we had in the first session. So please tell me when 9 minutes are up so that I know where I am and can wrap up very shortly. I timed this for 10 minutes. The rest of this conference moves beyond the ARCE to include the archival universe of audiovisual research archives. These are hot times in audiovisual archiving for a number of reasons. Changing technology, research priorities, funding sources, demands of local communities, and the burgeoning field of archival sciences have brought some important critical perspectives and also some wonderful opportunities for audiovisual archives. In 2012, Carolyn Landau and Jonat Topfarjian provocatively suggested that we ethnomusicologists are all archivists now. But today, in 2022, nearly 6 billion smartphone users are citizen archivists. They do what archives do. They acquire new materials, they're organizing them, preserving them, and discarding them, disseminating them on a variety of digital media outlets. Many kinds of individual and community archives are jostling one another and challenging the relevance of audiovisual research archives. And large for-profit companies are offering archive-like services, often with strings attached. Now, in 1999, in a conference that was mentioned in the previous session, when Shubha, Chaudhuri, and I organized a conference to discuss global perspectives on audiovisual archiving in the 21st century, we considered what we expected to be coming along, but we're once again in this conference not presenting papers during this conference. We hope that you will read the paper written for each of the panels before the panel starts, and that way they can all sing songs or do whatever they want and summarize their presentations. We've invited panelists and chairs with a variety of experiences and backgrounds, and the 6 panels over 3 days are an attempt to move an informal conference of 1999 in person to a virtual environment, and we hope that you will all participate in it, as happened at the end of the last with the questions that were provided. We hope also to make this conference available on a website in the future so that you can refer to it. This panel, this one, today is the second panel, will discuss what goes into an archive and what goes out of it. This includes, this is basically acquisitions and repatriation. Other sessions will treat different archival activities, including audio technology, preservation, resources, community archives, and broad public access. But here's another verse. Some researchers have subjects they want to ask about. Sometimes they have a theory on which they wish to cast doubt. They may make recordings that they want to last, so they bring them to an archives as a record of the past. It's hot times in the archives in 2022. It's hot times in the archives in selecting acquisitions. What should archives be collecting? Are we acquiring the right things? What sounds aren't we acquiring, and why? Whose music and dance heritages are we leaving out? These have always been central questions to archives and archivists, and they become even more urgent in the 21st century because analog recordings that are not digitized are in danger of being lost completely, and also because there's so much born digital collections to choose from. There's so much being recorded today, much more than when we all had to carry old heavy Naga recorders around. Now, most research archives have collections policies, acquisition policy related to the larger organization of which they are a part. Thus, AIISIST policies were related to efforts to repatriate to India recordings of music of India located abroad. And I think it's good to always reconsider acquisitions policies, because sometimes an opportunity arises and a situation arises where those need to be revised and rethought. When someone offers you a new option for acquisitions, it's important, I think, to answer the door to the knock, but not necessarily to agree to the effort. Some offers can overwhelm the capacity of an archive simply by the number of recordings in it, and the challenges of storing materials and processing them while continuing normal activities is very great. So how does an archive decide what's relevant? Advisory boards can be very helpful in calling archivists' attentions to things that they have overlooked or haven't thought about, but so is creating a network that includes community members, professional organizations like the Society for Ethnomusicology or the International Council for Traditional Music, and also archival professional organizations like the International Association of Sound and Audiovisual Archives. The debates and policies set in those organizations, and also as interpreted through friends and advisors, can provide an archive director and employees an important perspective on what should be acquired and why. Conferences like this one are also important, and so your input is always important, and we listen to it. Another verse. My collection of recordings is in an archive on a shelf. Does it interest only me or maybe somebody else? The communities I recorded may not know it exists. Repatriation, recirculation, and bringing it home can get this fixed. It's hot times in the archive, 2022. Yes, it's hot times in the archive in repatriation. Now, returning collections to the individuals and communities in which they were originally recorded is often referred to using the word repatriation. And it's an important part of archival entities today and activities today, and also a central ethnomusicological practice. It can be really hard to do successfully. Returning recordings may require an intermediary, often a scholar who has the language and research skills to locate the recordings and get them returned. It also needs an individual or community or some kind of group in the local community that's interested in getting the recordings back. Otherwise, it makes no sense. And also, it takes money. It's not easy to locate the materials. That sometimes digitization has to be paid for separately. So money is needed. But there are also some fundamental questions before the digitization, before the return actually starts. And one of those is, should something be returned? Music is not frivolous in all communities in the world. Music in some places can be a powerful being, a god in itself. Archives don't know what they have. They only know the file names, and they don't necessarily have all the information needed to decide whether something should be returned. but community members and researchers may. I'm thinking of a community scholar from an indigenous group in Brazil who went to Germany and found in the archive a song that was so powerful. She said, "This should not be returned to my community. It's too dangerous. No one can handle this kind of power there." So the result was that it was the recording and the material culture associated with it were locked in a box, not to be shown either to Europeans or to the originating community because it was too powerful. But if it can be returned, what should be returned? Should it be the original carriers? Should it be copies? Should it be MP3s that are not very high quality but are easy for the communities to use? And to whom should they be returned? Ideas of ownership vary widely about music and about knowledge all across the world. And a community, a lineage, a family, the heirs, that you have to, archives need to figure out somehow to whom to give it back. Otherwise, one could do more damage and be reviled for having given everything to somebody that didn't deserve it by the standards of the community and the standards of their art. And who should be involved in making these decisions? It's clearly important to get local community members involved in these decisions. It's also important to include people who are familiar with those communities, either as researchers or as friends. And it also, I think, is important for the archives to learn to coordinate the kinds of groups that will be created in order to do successful, thoughtful repatriations. In the future, perhaps, some future imagined, ethnomusicologists won't need to be thinking about this because everything will be digitized and communities will be able to decide for themselves how they want to repatriate. But don't hold your breath. There is a lot still to be digitized. There's a lot of metadata that needs to be integrated in some way so you can actually find it. And we need a translation program very badly that really works in our discussions. That's my 10 minutes. Hold it. Stop. And I now have a 30-second, I hope or so, because I'm on my last paragraph. Archives are a hot topic in 2022. There's a lot of writing about archives. There's a lot of debate about them. And in a digital universe with billions of smartphone users acting as archivists and creators, in an environment of for-profit companies providing seductive locations for posting recordings in exchange for ownership and advertising, and also in an age of increased attention to ethical standards and professional obligations, what is the role for audiovisual research archives today in acquisitions and repatriations? Hot times in the archives in 2022. Hot times for acquisitions and repatriations. Thank you for your patience, and well, welcome the panelists.
Thank you, Anthony Sigaji. I just would like to mention a few lines, which I told you right in the beginning that I had taken from your paper, which will go with me. That is, in 1999, the future now we live in wasn't imagined. So the digital archives is only 2 decades or maybe even less. Archive is not a single unit, acquisition, organizing, preserving, dissemination, providing access are group of functions. Considering them separately provides a more fine-grained understanding of change and continuity. I think this is very, very important for us when we are dealing with large volume of assets. This one was very interesting. 6.6 billion smartphone users are archivists as well. This is much more than the actual population of this earth, this world. And priorities of funding agencies. This is very important for me to have gone through this. The biases of collectors, the technology of the equipment available, and the acquisition policies of an archives all influence the content of the collection. Another thing which really touched me deeply was men in public made fun of women musicians. This happened in India in the beginning of last century. Seeger has talked about omissions and silences. This happens in government-funded archives based on political ideologies. Well, there are few more lines, but I won't take more time on this. Just, I would like to add on to the present day media archiving practices that most of the media archives are outsourced now for at least preservation and getting it back for their use. And it is preserved in glaciers, clouds, and all those places, because actually handling the assets, even if it is filed, it's very difficult, time consuming, and it's not economical. So now I invite the panelists. The first panelist is Val Montlain, is a researcher of the Center for Humanities Research, University of the Western Cape. With a focus on the development of research archives, he has also worked as a university arts administrator, sound archivist, and cultural advocate, and played curational and leadership roles at the District 6 Museum in Cape Town, the Cain Cairo National Arts Festival, and arts advocacy on the African continent. His current research interests include sound studies and archives. In 2019, he completed his doctoral thesis titled Goma's Refrain, Sonic Anticipation and the Music in Cape, and is currently preparing a monograph based on this research. Welcome, Val Montlain. Please offer your remarks on the paper.
Thank you very much. I understand that I have about 10 minutes. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. The AIISE, especially Shubha and Tony, for this opportunity. When I was invited to be part of the workshop and conference all those years ago, I did not realize what a formative influence it would be on my thinking and my experience. So I consider myself to be very privileged to have been able to encounter the people I met there, and also to learn, and to, in a sense, understand the way of learning that we all had to engage in, the kind of methods that we use to think about archives. So I think back very fondly about that time, and I also, in my work now with archives, I continue to draw on that experience. So it has been a wellspring of really rich discussion. In my response, about 2 instances of archives where I've worked in a purposeful way with making archival institutions. The one is, both of them have been mentioned in the introduction. The one is working with a community in Cape Town, South Africa, who had been forced off their land. And that community happens to be quite an important part of the cultural life of urban South Africa, in a particular part of South Africa. So I will reflect on the making of the archive and what it has taught me looking back now, all these years later. And then also now recently, I've been working with the university to revive its collection. So the university has much bigger, more expansive collections. And in both cases, there are interesting questions to think about from that experience of the AIISE conference. The first thing to think about is that the discipline of ethnomusicology, and it has Can you hear or see me?
Yeah, we can hear you. I think you should please keep your video off so that since you are not on a good bandwidth.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, I will do that. So I was saying that there is a complicated relationship with ethnomusicology because of the ways in which the apartheid governments abused concept of ethnicity. And so in a sense, with the museum collection where I worked, and today with a younger generation of scholars, there is still an interesting but complicated relationship. And in some ways, the complicatedness of it is in itself something that is generative, because young people are very excited about engaging with archives, even as they are critical of the institutional histories of those archives. There's a huge interest, for example, in thinking about traditional instrumentation. Lots of young people are involved in new kinds of music making and new kinds of storytelling, and want to go back to the International Library of African Music, are very curious about engaging with it in that space. We will also, as a university, in 2023, play host to what is now a reconfigured scholarly community, which has emerged from two branches of music scholarship, ethnomusicology and kind of African music studies on the one hand, and the more formalized kind of musicological scholarship on the other. And what is interesting about that collaboration next year is that the interest expressed by the scholarly community more broadly in South Africa is in working with what the university has identified as questions about sound. In a much more general way, we're working with DJs, we're working with a kind of emerging DJ culture in South Africa that is trying to draw quite directly on the traditional music, bodies of traditional music in different collections in South Africa. The one thing that I think has emerged in thinking about Tony's paper was what you mentioned about the idea that perhaps in trying to refigure or reposition archives for the future, to think about archives as a group of functions. And it is a very interesting proposition because, of course, we are now all working in the digital space, and that is where accessibility and access really gets animated and manifest. And my work in the last few years has been to provide a kind of, with a team of colleagues, to think about what would be a well-considered best practice regime with which to build this archive of the university, which is an archive largely of the anti-apartheid movement. But inside of that, the other important strategic thrust in the university, and I won't go into the long history, it is a historically Black university in South Africa, which was never allowed to have an arts program. And so the decision that the leadership of the university has made is, what would it take for our humanities faculty to build an arts program that is more appropriate, given the critique about decolonization, given the critiques of these disciplines? What would it, instead of just critiquing, what would it be to build an arts program with an archive that is able to, in a sense, demonstrate a more ethical and a more responsive kind of scholarly approach to building these collections and to making sure that they are accessible? So we have an exciting opportunity, in a sense, to become incumbent makers of an archive, and to, in a sense, model based on these some of concerns and misgivings that we've had. And so one of the things that I spent a lot of time thinking about was the kind of the landscape of best practice that is given to us through a massive organization like the American Space Agency, NASA, which has built this open archival system, information system, and to think about what would it be to imagine the OIIS system as an ethical framework with which to build something that is, even though it comes out of a kind of almost a filtering of very digital thinking about digital media, but also about what the cloud, even though we speak about digitization as one concept, I think when it was being done 20, 25 years ago, as compared to what it is now in the context of cloud and artificial intelligence and machine learning and all those things, they are probably, there's probably a wealth of distinction that we can make between the different kinds of digitization and the objects that we're talking about. And so there is a question there, and I want to sort of tentatively suggest that maybe it would be helpful to think about infrastructures, not just as the physical kind of heavy machinery and heavy systems that we need to have in place to make digital archiving viable, but to think of it also in terms of these different functions and roles and responsibilities that are not necessarily going to ever be able to match the budgets and the reach of the big technology stacks like Amazon or NASA or Apple or any one of those big companies that now kind of provides cloud services. But indeed, there is something in the framework that the open initiative, it's concerned with accessibility, it's concerned with future communities, the idea of making sure that digital material is accessible to communities way past the current technological horizon. And it's interesting to think about that, because I remember listening to Dietrich Schuller in those conversations in Delhi, speaking about a very similar idea, making sure that we always take with a pinch of salt what the claims and the magical claims sometimes of big technology, of the shiny new technological promise that the CD or the mini disc or other kind of formats had presented to us. So yeah, I guess perhaps out of all of this, it is a question, in addition to the kind of propositions that Tony has made about the ways in which we always have to center people and the community and the considerations of community in working with archive on the one hand, but also to think about the ways in which the digital and the cloud and the distributed cloud, in a sense, makes possible the kind of shared responsibilities of interoperability between archives that is made possible in this kind of cloud and distributed era. I think about it also because what we're involved with is institution making. And so acquisition, in the sense, in the regular business of an archive, is about making decisions about what to collect. But sometimes in the making, and certainly in our experience, it is also part of building an institution. So we see ourselves facing already a backlog of non-profit organizations, community organizations, which have folded over time, which have died and now need to find a home for materials that have become obsolete in a sense, or are no longer being able to perform the function that they have. And so they look to institutions such as archives to give a new life and a second life, a repurposing, as somebody said earlier, to material that already has had a life, a prior life. So even though we are mindful of due diligence, sometimes we don't have the resources for proper stewardship planning. And we face backlogs as the kind of inevitable consequence of having an archive.
Yeah, I would thank you for this wonderful brief on the African situation, African archive world. Now I would welcome Amlan Dasgupta ji, who was a professor of English and director of the School of Culture, Texts and Records, Jadavpur University. His research interests include North Indian classical music and digital humanities, as well as European classical and early modern literature and thought. Amlanji, for your comments.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here because for whatever archiving work that I have done along with my colleagues at Jadavpur University, where I taught. The model of the ARC has been a very important one. We came to digitizing audio collections fairly late, that is to say after 2000, starting in 2004. But very soon, I mean, we, as most people who start with something that they have very little idea about, we learned a bit on the job. Then we looked around for models, and the most important model for us has been over these years the model of ARC, and there have been more direct connections between the ARC and Jadavpur's archive of North Indian classical music. We started in 2004 with funding on the documentation of rare text programs made available by the Indian University Grants Commission. Over the last 2 decades or so, the archive grew substantially, and at present there is about, I think, something like 8,000 hours of recorded music in digital form, as well as a corpus of music on loan awaiting digitization, which I think is true of most such archives. We received 2 major grants from the British Library under its Endangered Archives program, as well as funds from the UGC to its various programs of institutional support. The COVID years sadly saw an almost total shutdown of activities of the archive, and only in the last month has work resumed on a modest scale. So what we have tried to do is to represent as extensively as possible what has been preserved, the music that has been recorded either for commercial purposes, for private enjoyment, over about 100 years. And that's important because our recordings, most of it comes from private recordings, concert recordings, or in some cases teaching tapes, which have been lent to us by their creators or by people who collected them. And therefore we are different from broadcast archives or institutional archives. What we have really is a collection of collections, each of them individually drawing upon countless others through processes of re-recording, exchange, and gift. This makes, as you will immediately realize, the question of rights very, very difficult to sort. But then again, this material was there, this material was circulating among music collectors, and I think that we seized the opportunity to put as much of it as we could on some platform where other people could consult it and use it, researchers or musicians or whoever. Looking upon them, one is struck by how individual desire is configured. Some collectors seem to have preferred to collect shellac disc, others vinyl, yet others on reel or cassette tape. Some spread their net wide and preserve the music of artists from different ages and places. Others often concentrated on single musicians. We were lucky to acquire recordings of the late Ustad Mushtaq Ali Khan Sahab of the Jaipur Sitar style from a collector who pretty much limited his interest to the single maestro. In each case, it is choices and preferences of the individual collectors which set the mark of distinctiveness upon their holdings. They contain, to put it a little imaginatively, their musical autobiographies, the music that they loved and valued and preserved against many odds. The original holdings were obviously in a variety of media, shellac, vinyl, magnetic tape, and so on. But through digitization, all forms of music pass into the undifferentiated space of digital media. The single most important difference between the archive and the collection is the repositioning of desire. Even the most humble of archives has to excise desire from the way one considers the collection. If choice exists at the moment of deciding whether or not to include the collection, it is the moment of acquisition. It can be legitimately exercised only if the material is either irrelevant or is a duplication. Once there is a decision to digitize the material, The whole of the collection needs to be incorporated into the archive in keeping with protocols well established and codified. In the case of these concert recordings, this becomes quite a problem because there are multiple sources from which we get the same recording, but in our case, we've kept them all because one may possibly be a better recording than another. The collection recognizes only one user, the collector herself. The archive strives, I don't know how effectively, for neutrality in respect of the processes of acquisition. But archives, even the slightest of them, have also to bear in mind the desire of future users. What we do know is justified only in the image of that shadowy and unimaginable figure of the future. How can we speak of the desire of that user? The archive, and I will speak here only of the digital archive, is founded upon an act of faith that what we collect in the here and now will somehow endure till the time that it enters into the retrospective desire of a community of users, perhaps today or tomorrow, or perhaps a few years hence. But it takes courage, not to say foolhardiness, to think of the future at all in the digital domain. If the digital archive is born as a counter to the inhospitability of the present to the past, the future to which it looks may in fact be an illusion. It can hardly be otherwise. Some digital archives will endure and others will not. Adding to the frighteningly large pile of digital debris, the storm that we call progress drives us towards. The internet is the veritable graveyard of dead archives, still present in some ghostly abstract form, but beyond access and experience. I have built a monument more enduring than brass, wrote the Latin poet Horace of his poetry. The digital archive can only expect to live as long as they are users, and hopefully these users will take the responsibility of finding new platforms for these files. This is at least an articulation of a desire that all archivists may be permitted to have, even if it is a consolatory ruse to stave off despair and inaction. I was very moved and greatly enlightened by Anthony Seeger's marvelous paper, particularly on questions of acquisition, of repatriation. It is not something that we have done very much of, apart from return music to members of families of musicians, in some cases, not very often, but still, in some cases, we were able to do that. And we faced some problems, as Anthony has written so perceptively, about who one returns it to and whether we are justified in making decisions in this regard, or we just have to go with it and face the flag if it comes our way. I don't know the answer to these questions, really. And also to Valmont's really sensitive comments on the problems with deciding on what and to preserve, and also the problem which is posed by the presence of large multinational operators in the field. Have been greatly enlightened by them, and thank them for their contributions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Kamlini, you're muted. Yeah.
Yeah, now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, I want to add a couple of lines to what Amlanji said. That in India, it must be the same elsewhere also. There are institutions like Kalakshetra, like Music Academy and Ravindra Bharati, and also individual gurus who run institutions to teach the arts, and they are also performers. They also have wonderful collection, and they don't know how to go about it, preserving and digitizing and making it available for the future. So I always used to think, maybe this is the right way to think or not. You experts will tell us, to have an archive consortium and help us provide them that kind of a facility or support to digitize, and keep their content and assets available for their own institute and also for the larger interest of the community of musicians and artists. Now, I welcome Shubha Chaudhuri ji, who will be the last panelist for this session. She is Associate Director General Academic of the American Institute of Indian Studies and has worked at the Archives and Research Center of Ethnomusicology since its inception and been director since 1985. In the field of audiovisual archiving, her major interests have been database applications, research archives, and ethnomusicology issues of intellectual property rights and community archives. Her fieldwork has been in Western Rajasthan, Goa, and Kutch. She has served as Vice President of the International Association of Sound and Audiovisual Archives, the Executive Board of the ICTM, International Council of Traditional Music, and as Council Member of the Society of Ethnomusicology. She is a member of the IASA Research Archives section and the Training and Education Committee. Shubhaji.
Thank you, Kamalini ji. Thank you, Tony, for the wonderful song, which we have learned to expect from you and your paper, as Valmont and Amlan added so many very eloquent and sensitive ways of thinking about issues of acquisition and repatriation that Tony has raised in his paper. Now, my brief here was to respond to Tony's paper in terms of ARCE, and I will restrict myself to talking about 2 or 3 topics here. This is also taking on from our earlier session to say how we have moved on from our earliest policies, from what we set out to be, in many ways, continuing what was laid down as the basic objectives, in some ways evolving and changing. Talking about acquisition, we, as you heard, started out with a policy very strongly supporting repatriation. Nazir-Jairazbhoy, our founder, was extremely focused on this being our main goal, not just repatriation, but to prevent collections from being in a state where they would have to be repatriated, which meant that we should contact scholars and collectors who were working in India to deposit their collections with us before they left India. That was how we started. So it was an archive of a repository model based on voluntary deposit. But as time went on, we did change, changes in policy or changes in the kind of agreements that we made. All of these ended up changing our what we ended up acquiring. Now, how we positioned ourselves as an ethnomusicology archive, as a research archive, are topics that Tony has dealt with in his paper. This influenced what we would say would be our acquisition policy, because as we identified ourselves with ethnomusicology, we spoke of music in all its contexts being as relevant to being accepted in the archives. As time went on, we did focus on getting these collections of foreign scholars deposited in the archive. The reason for focusing on foreign scholars was that once these recordings left the country, they would be deposited in archives abroad and not be accessible to Indian users and the community. So we gave priority to these collections. We also worked with many scholars to bring back to India collections that they would have made on before the archive started, as Bonnie Wade has talked about her collection, as Nazir-Jairazbhoy's collection mentioned by Amy, but many, many more scholars cooperated with us to bring back their recordings. We also worked with bringing back historic collections with the help of the British Library, with the CNRS Paris, and this is something that we've continued doing. But we did move on in the first few decades to collections that were in India, that were threatened for lack of preservation, collections that would otherwise not survive if they were not brought into an archive. And this is what really changed the kind of acquisitions that we've had over the last couple of decades. Going on to more aspects of how we changed our agreements also, because we wanted to open up more to the community. We started out as an archive of scholars, by scholars, for scholars, but we gradually moved to a more community-based approach, and our policies started to reflect that. We opened up our policies to community use, to recommend to depositors that they be available always to the community, to assure performer access. And also we had to make changes because of the internet, because suddenly there was a possibility of putting things online, something that we could have never dreamt of in 1982. So we have introduced various options now in our agreement that allow us to put up samples, or with Smithsonian Folkways, which was Global Sound, to put up tracks for paid downloads with the permission of the performers and the collectors. So things have moved on in what we looked at acquiring. We also started field work in the late 80s, and so that became another source of acquisition, making recordings ourselves that came into the archives. And most recently, doing digitization projects that brought in digital content, partnering with other archives such as the Rupa and Sansthan. So the kind of acquisitions that we've made in the last few years have reflected the changes in how we think of ARCE from the time when it started. I also wanted to speak a little bit about collaborative archiving or community archives, partnering with community archives, which is something that Tony has spoken about in his paper. This is something that we start, as I mentioned, this kind of approach came in right from our first project that Dan led in Rajasthan in 1988, 89. And we moved on to doing the Archives and Community Partnership Project in Rajasthan and Goa, which was funded by the Ford Foundation. And one of the kind of work that we did for that project was also repatriation, because we brought out a series of CDs of archival recordings that the community members had expressed a desire to hear of iconic musicians. So bringing them out as CDs allowed us to do this legally, to provide royalties in advance to the families or to the musicians, and have the musicians community be able to distribute them among the community by giving them a quarter of what was published for free. So these were the kinds of projects that we've been doing. We worked also in Kutch with Survani, with the Kutch Mahila Vikas Sangathan, to help create a community-based archive. We have worked with the Manganiyar Lok Sangeet Sansthan, a community archive of Manganiyars, who we tried to train, support with equipment and so on, as well as in Nagaland with the Chekrazemi Society for Cultural Preservation in the village of Pek, where community members wanted to create an archive of their own music. So these are the kinds of projects that we've done with collaborating with the community. Speaking of repatriation and bringing back collections, this is, it just seems, as we have been discussing, not enough to just say they are brought back to India and so they're now accessible. We need to work more to getting these to the community in ways that make sense to them. And we've made a beginning with that with the recent digitized material from Rupayan Sansthan, where we have in fact made provision now to provide copies to the families of the performers who were recorded earlier, and very often to performers of their own recordings made many years ago. So it's just digital technology that's making these possible, that we can now at fairly affordable costs put recordings on USB drives, and that today, even in villages, people have access to the kind of digital technology that they're able to use these. So these are just the kind of beginnings that we are making to move the repatriation to another level. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Shubhaji. I'm really enlightened by all the participants to know about what quality of field work is being done, and also the sharing and the responsibility one feels towards the communities and also towards the world at large. Thank you, Amlanji. Thank you, Anthony ji, and thank you, Valmont ji, and also Shubhaji for this wonderful session. Now I open this session for anyone wanting to interact with the panelists and the speaker.
Do you have another verse, Tony?
Thank you very much for the careful reading and some of the wonderful questions you asked and raised and elaborated on. That's what I hoped would happen, and I hope that there are other questions out there. But I should clarify that I don't know where that number came from for the number of users of cell phones. I suspect it probably is the number of all the cell phones ever manufactured, and rather than the number of users. But there are billions out there who are doing what we do every day in terms of acquisitions. Collectors are a very important part of archives, and creating archives as collections of collections is really what most research archives do. Broadcast archives are distinctive. Though I ran a record company archive and we acquired other record companies. So we did also have a collection of collections, even though it wasn't a single record company archive. So that's all I think I have to say, except that I'm so glad the speakers amplified some of the things that I only mentioned and really brought new perspectives on them. Was very thoughtful, as was everybody else. Anybody have a question or?
I see a question here from Sanjay Vats, who's asking if we have any archival policy. Maybe Kamlini ji, if you can look at the chat window.
Yeah, that is.
And at the Q&A, yes.
Yeah, that's right.
We have a couple of Q&A.
Archival policy, I think, will depend on archives, independent archives, individual archives, and it cannot, the entire world cannot have one archival policy. The broadcasters also do not have a common archival policy. It all depends on your work and what you want to do with that content and how do you disseminate it. The policy is only for in-house use, and that in-house use depends on each archives. They will determine what the policy should be. Anything else you would like to answer, Amlanji, because you are dealing with the content in the university. So if you have a policy for dealing with archival content.
You're muted, Amlan.
Just wait, please. Yes, thank you. Yes, policy. In the kind of work that I do, policies are the only policy that we have is that we ask the contributor whether this music can be listened to on site by anybody at all who comes and wants to listen to it. If it is, because we are working with public money, as we see, and our remit is to provide this music to the community as we see it, and it is the immediate community, those who can actually walk into Jadavpur University and come to our office and listen to this music. We provide modest facilities for listening to it. If there are requests for copies, we refer them to the collectors. The collectors, if they want to share them, will share them. It is not for us to take a decision in this matter. Regarding what, because you see, the great problem with this entire business is that this music has been held, is circulating from the 1950s, and I'm not just thinking of the official recordings, to say the published recordings, but private recordings. They've been circulating for the last 70 years or so, I think 50s onwards, certainly. Now these, some are radio recordings, some are made at people's houses or at concerts or wherever. Now, they have circulated, and many people possess parts of them, of this vast, as it were, corpus which exists. And we have all listened to it, and this is how we came to this entire thing, that we wanted people to be able to listen to this. Now, I am aware that they are on very sticky ground, and my lawyers, friends, advised me that this was, in fact, a problem, because we, as my lawyer friend, very eminent expert in this field, has told me that, see, the first problem is that you are changing the format. You have analog, you're making it a digital. You are violating the law. Absolutely, there's no question there. But the other thing that he said is that go ahead, do what you can. If there is a problem, we'll look after it. The university will not allow me to take decisions which affect the reputation of the university. So these are constraints, but within that, our aim has been to, as it were, show what exists in this field, because so much of Indian classical music recorded between 1950 and say about 1980 or 1990, which is a great period of some of the greatest maestros, exists only in these forms of either reel tape or cassette tape or something like that. It is, I think that it was important for us to put that in a place where people could come and listen to it. Thank you.
I think just to add, when you say, do you have an archival policy? I think I've always felt what distinguishes an archive from a collection is policies. That we have policies for acquisition, we have policies for preservation, we have policies for access, we have policies for dissemination. So, I mean, I think there isn't just one archival policy, and every archive has to develop its own. But we have a bunch of questions in the Q&A. Kamlini ji, if you want.
I can see one more.
No, there's 3 more in the Q&A.
Which is not the chat?
No, not the chat. There's the Q&A, if you see at the bottom of the screen.
Okay, now can I read out the chat question after Sanjay Vatsa?
Yeah, no, at the chat it says, thank you for sharing on the acquisition policies and repatriation. With time and aging, magnetic media decomposes and may need to be discarded. How do the institutions work on deaccession policies, and how are they implemented? I would answer first from ARCE that we do not get rid of the analog recordings. We preserve them very carefully because we never know when we might want to go back to them. But I hand it over to our other panelists.
I am seeing a question in the chat also. We are working on a request of the University of WA in Seattle to repatriate a physical recording cylinder to a Pacific Northwest tribe. They also want all copies destroyed. what are your thoughts on the kind of repatriation? Doesn't decolonizing the archives ultimately mean emptying some of our shelves? Yeah, I think Anthony Seeger should answer this, maybe.
Yes, sure. This is a delicate question, but I think this is the sort of thing you discuss. David McAllister had his films of the Navajo burned in public with the Navajo participants, because he felt and they felt that they were sacred and inappropriate, therefore, to be on film held in an archive. It's quite possible that there will be some emptier shelves. On the other hand, aside from some indigenous peoples, most of the people in the world are actually very happy to have their recordings available and are very happy to get them back. And so I think part of the decolonization is giving people back what they will make them happy and perhaps be an inspiration to them in the future. I think when a group says, no, we want it all recorded, we don't think there's any source of inspiration in the future, we will keep it to ourselves. That, I think, is another aspect, but I don't think that it negates the importance of sharing, because so much music in the world is unknown and can give great inspiration and joy to the people who receive it.
We have a question in the Q&A. How do archive deal with IPR issues with communities and artists? For example, Mr. Irfan Zuberi, presenting on 28th October, has published many records for which permission may not have been taken, though he claims there was a committee. Did the committee really have a word with us, artists? I think it is for...
It's a hard one for us to answer, though. Amlan and I both have been on a committee.
It is for Irfan to take this question up. We can only talk about our own policies, as it were. And certainly I would not publish anything at all from the archive. The university would sack me.
Yeah.
So I cannot do that. I can only refer if somebody wants a copy, a researcher, for instance, as many researchers came to me from various parts of various universities and said that, is it possible to have copies of these recordings, because they're very rare and not available elsewhere. So I referred them to the collectors, and then if they struck up some kind of deal, in most cases they did. I mean, I don't really think that no researcher went back empty-handed. I sent them to whoever had given it, and they were glad to provide them with copies of these recordings, because I think that it was, they were also happy that people were working on these things.
Coming to IPR, though, we need performers' permission. There's performer right now.
Yes, performer rights.
It's a naughty issue, and I think we are both agreed that we would not publish things without performer permission.
Lawrence has a lot to say on this with regard to the 78 RPM things. But when you get to concert recordings, there is really, say there is a recording of a fairly, a fairly modest violin player, and not modest, I would say, a pandit. But he's playing accompanied on tabla by Hamidjan, who is the greatest tabla player of all time. Now, whose copyright is it? Most people would say that I think that the rules are that it is the main artist mentioned in the label, the main artist. Accompanied by doesn't really count for much. So you don't need permission from Hamidjan Tharapwa. You need permission from whoever the main artist is. So these are questions. However, I think most people who listen to it for Hamidjan Tharapwa's brilliant accompaniment more than anything. Yeah. So these are questions which I think are so complicated, and I don't think that there is a uniform answer to this. From my perspective, I've done what I can, and I've put it out for people to come and listen to. if anybody were to complain to me that you are putting my music up, say, or I don't think, I mean, I just put this to, if somebody's grandson came and you can't put the music of my grandfather up, would I take it down? I don't know. I mean, I've never faced this, but I don't know. But I've never faced this. But certainly if some musician came and told me that you cannot keep my recordings in your archive, I would take it, definitely. I would take them out of circulation. And this is a question that we enter into with every contributor and get them to into this, that the music that you are giving us, we cannot record it and then keep it away, not for people to listen to. If you agree, only then when you sign something saying that you agree to this, then I will put it in the archive and use it as a kind of research tool, which I think that some rather dodgy provisions of the IPR Act in India offers me some protection. Lawrence assured me at one point, and my other friends like Obhik, you remember Obhik? He also said that, you don't need to worry. And there are other types like ours, like Praful Anubhai's great work in the Saptak archive. That's also.
The artists whom Doordarshan recorded paid for broadcast, but when we started digitizing and also publishing CDs and DVDs, we went to individual artists, took their permission, paid the royalty in advance, and then only we published CDs and DVDs. So we didn't have any IPR problems that way. I think the best way to go, take permission and then do it. Now, next question is from.
He has his hand up, Kamlini ji.
A response.
This is an important.
All India Radio performed, published some recordings of artists who were dead by the time the recordings came out. So what happened then? To whom did you go? And was there a policy there that who was the correct person to give you the permission? This is again draws upon Antony's insights into who, this question of repatriation. He approached through repatriation. Who do we return it to? And who has authority to grant such permission? These are questions. I really think that I am not the right person to answer these questions, but Shubha is the right person.
Well, if I could jump in.
Yes, please.
It's an important question, but I don't think we should spend the whole time discussing it. I do think, on the other hand, that one of the major frustrations people have with archives is that they can't listen to what they want to listen to from an archive, but they can go on YouTube and find all kinds of things. So I think one of our challenges, and one of the reasons that people have difficulty understanding what archives are and what they do, is that there is a whole for-profit universe out there that doesn't seem to need to follow the same laws that we have to, because and I think the laws will probably have to change over time, because I think people are using that. But even when they change, laws are slow to change. Practice is quick, and in the meantime, archives are really suffering from having a bad reputation as being places, well, they've got it, but you can't use it from them, and that's a very serious problem.
We have two questions in chat, and I think not much time, so maybe we should look at them.
In the chat, actually, Sanjay asks disposal policy. I think we in Doordarshan, we don't have a disposal policy because nothing should be trashed. Now it's for others to answer this.
Yeah, the Q&A has two more questions.
Yeah, Q&A, just 1 second. From Lalita Perrin, Stanford. I was struck by Tony's story of the woman who said the material was too powerful to be returned. In cases where a community member has such an opinion, how is this verified as being representative? What if there are opposing voices from within a community? How material is handled?
That's a wonderful question, and it is complicated, but in this particular case, she was part of the committee that was talking about this, included an anthropologist, ethnomusicologist who's been working in the region for many years and doing repatriation of the German recordings from early in the 20th century for many years. And so there was someone else there who was part of the decision. And I think deciding just to lock it up rather than destroying it leaves the option of people who didn't agree with that to eventually access those materials.
Now there is another question from Janet Top-Falgium. As part of the repatriation process, I wonder how we ensure that knowledge is gathered from communities represented on the recordings so that this can further circulate. It's often from the archives holding the content that information dissemination, at least on the internet, for example, unless community information is gathered back into the archives. We are in danger of perpetuating what might be misinformation, poor or incorrect, etc. How do we bring the relevant knowledge experts within communities into the archive multiverse? I quite like the word circulate when we talk about repatriation.
I'd like to answer that a little bit. We've worked with Janet a lot, so we share these concerns. And I totally agree with her because every time we have worked with older recordings, when we want to put them out, for example, on Global Sound, or when we work with performers or the communities, we find things wrongly identified, wrongly labeled. And it is a big concern. And but it needs a lot of resources. We were able to do this, Janet, with the EAP project because we had the money and EAP was flexible enough to let us bring musicians to the archive to identify and help us document things further for us to be able to take recordings to where people were. And so now the metadata that we have for these two projects of EAP and MEAP have been actually worked with the community to fill up the gaps in the metadata, also to correct a lot of misinformation. But it is really a luxury that we don't always have. There's also so much material that doesn't have information, as you know very well. I mean, we might just get a few phrases on it or a date. And it really needs experts and community members to do this. But it's a really tough one, and I'm glad we could do it for these two projects. Thank you. Over to anybody else.
Oh, could I jump in?
Sorry.
Is it okay? I would just add to that. I was hoping that the internet too would help us out so that the communities can help document the recordings that are in the archives without necessarily having to come. How you decide who actually has who's got the total view is a problem. But I think this is one of the places where internet technology can in fact help, and crowdsourcing can help archives achieve some of the potential that Janet talks about in her question. And I think
there's I think one more question. Aparna is wanting to listen to discussions on de-accession policies. How are the institutions panelists working in? Are they having different policies for born digital versus digitized material on the archives? I think once it is a file format, whether it came from analog or whether it is born digital doesn't need to be having a different policies.
Yeah.
It will be governed by the same policy, I think.
I think it's just a different workflow, not policies on how you use them or how you disseminate. I think it just is a difference in workflow because you don't have to digitize them anymore if they came in born digital.
You can't do anything about it.
Yeah.
You cannot in any way. The digital file is what will stay.
Yeah.
So I think that's it for the day and for this session.
Perfect time.
Yeah, it's 10 minutes to 11.
10:50
I think
is when we
we
were
are
ending.
on time. Yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you all of you once again for being in this session and allowing me to conduct the session in the manner I wish to. Yeah.
Thank you, Kamalini-ji.
Wonderful.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
God bless all of you.
Thank you all.
And come back tomorrow.
Yes.
See you all tomorrow. Thank you.
We have 280 registered participants now.
Wonderful. That's really good number.
Okay. Good night. Bye-bye.
Bye. Namaste.